Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most intimate invasions, a time when your wedding night belonged not to you, but to the church, your family, and a crowd of eager witnesses. Imagine standing at your bedroom door not alone with your beloved, but surrounded by priests, relatives, and neighbors, all waiting to ensure you fulfilled your marital duty. This was medieval Europe, where the marriage bed was never truly private, and your most intimate moment became a public spectacle. What happened behind those curtains? Who decided when you could touch your own spouse? And why did couples accept this extraordinary intrusion? The answers might shock you, because the rules were far stranger than you ever imagined. So before we step into this fascinating world together, I'd love your support. If you find tonight's story intriguing, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, but only when you genuinely enjoy what you hear. I'm curious, where are you right now? Tucked into bed in New York, winding down after a long day in California? Drop a comment and let me know when and where you started this journey with me. Your thoughts mean everything. Now, dim those lights, let the soft sounds of the night settle around you, and let's travel back to a time when even newlyweds had no privacy. Picture this. It's your wedding day in 1400 England. You've exchanged vows in the church, the feast has ended, and now comes the moment you've been both anticipating and dreading. But you won't be walking to your bedroom alone. Oh no. Your father-in-law leads the procession carrying a flaming torch. Behind him, your mother-in-law and a gaggle of aunts, cousins, and village women follow, giggling and whispering. The men bring up the rear, your brothers, your husband's friends, the parish priest with his holy water and prayer book. This isn't a private moment. This is theatre. They call it the bedding ceremony, and in medieval Europe it was as essential to marriage as the wedding vows themselves. You see, the church and society needed proof, tangible, witnessed proof, that a marriage had been consummated. Without it, the union could be annulled. Fortunes could be lost, alliances could crumble. So privacy was a luxury medieval couples simply couldn't afford. The ceremony began with preparation. In wealthier households, women would decorate the bridal chamber hours before, draping the bed with the finest linens the family could afford. They scattered grain across the mattress, wheat or barley, as a folk charm for fertility. After all, children weren't just a blessing. They were an economic necessity, the very purpose of marriage. In poorer homes, the preparation was simpler, but no less significant. Even peasant families borrowed their best blankets, their softest pillows, because this night mattered. Then came the priest. Ah yes, the priest. Before the couple even entered the room, a clergyman would step forward to bless the bed itself. He'd sprinkle holy water on the mattress, reciting prayers that invoked God's favour for fertility and protection against evil spirits. One common blessing asked the Lord to bless the couple, just as you blessed Tobias and Sarah, daughter of Raguel. This reference to the biblical book of Tobit was deliberate. Tobias and Sarah had waited 3 nights before consummating their marriage, praying for divine blessing. Medieval priests hoped newlyweds would show similar restraint and piety. These 3 nights of abstinence became known as the Tobias nights, and they were taken seriously in many regions. The idea was that a couple shouldn't rush into the physical act driven by lust. Instead, they should approach it with prayer, contemplation, and spiritual preparation. Imagine being exhausted from your wedding festivities, finally alone with your spouse, or so you think, only to be told you must wait 3 more nights before truly beginning your married life. For some couples, this must have felt like torture. For others, perhaps it was a welcome reprieve from performance anxiety. But let's return to that crowded bedroom. Once the bed was blessed, the real spectacle began. The bride was led away by the women, her mother, her sisters, her closest female relatives. They'd undress her in a separate room, removing her wedding gown layer by layer, replacing it with the thin white nightgown. Meanwhile, the men did the same for the groom in another chamber. This wasn't just about changing clothes, it was a ritual of transition, transforming maiden and bachelor into wife and husband. Then came the procession back to the bedroom. The women would escort the bride singing bawdy songs that would make you blush even today. These songs were often hilariously explicit, full of jokes about consummation, fertility, and marital duties. The men would bring the groom, cheering and jesting, slapping him on the back with hearty encouragement. When both parties arrived at the bedroom door, the real ceremony began. The couple was ceremoniously placed into bed together. Not gently tucked in, mind you, but rather unceremoniously deposited onto the mattress while everyone watched. In England, there was a charming tradition, and by charming I mean absolutely mortifying. The wedding guests would remove their stockings and throw them at the couple lying in bed. If your stocking hit the bride or groom, superstition said you'd be the next to marry. Can you imagine? You're trying to mentally prepare for your wedding night and suddenly you're being pelted with sweaty stockings by your drunk Uncle Edward who's desperately hoping to find a wife. In Scandinavia, the ritual was even more structured and frankly more invasive. Swedish law in some provinces required at least 6 witnesses to observe the couple in bed together before the marriage was considered legally valid. 6 people, watching, waiting. The most distinguished guest, perhaps a local lord or a respected elder, had the honour of leading the bride to the bed in a festive procession. Once the couple was tucked in, the witnesses would offer them dishes of food and drink, quickly eating alongside them before finally, mercifully, leaving them alone. But why? Why would anyone tolerate this invasion of privacy? To understand, we need to grasp what was at stake. In medieval society, marriage wasn't primarily about love. It was a legal contract, an economic transaction, a political alliance. For noble families, a marriage could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin, between peace and war. The bride brought a dowry, land, money, livestock. The groom provided security and status, but none of it mattered unless the marriage was consummated. Consummation established legitimacy. It meant any children born would be lawful heirs with rights to property and titles. Without proof of consummation, either party could later claim the marriage was never valid and seek an annulment. This created enormous anxiety for families who had invested heavily in the union, so they insisted on witnesses. They demanded public bedding ceremonies. They needed assurance that their investments were secure. Consider the case of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who married Prince Arthur of England in 1501. Catherine was just 15 years old. Arthur was also 15. After their wedding, they were publicly bedded according to tradition. Witnesses saw them placed together in the marriage bed, observed the bed curtains drawn, and heard the appropriate sounds that suggested consummation. Or did they? Years later, when Arthur died and Catherine sought to marry his brother Henry, the man who would become Henry VIII, the question of that wedding night became explosive. Had Arthur and Catherine actually consummated their marriage? Catherine swore they hadn't, claiming Arthur had been too young and weak. Henry initially believed her and married her anyway. But decades later, when Henry desperately wanted to divorce Catherine, he claimed she'd lied, that she had consummated her marriage to Arthur, making her marriage to Henry invalid. The bedding ceremony witnesses were suddenly crucial. What exactly had they seen and heard that night in 1501? Their testimony would determine the fate of a queen, the legitimacy of a princess, Mary, Catherine's daughter, and potentially the religious future of England. This is how much power the bedding ceremony held. A few minutes of witnessed ritual could echo through decades, shaping history itself. But not every bedding ceremony was so fraught with political consequence. For most couples, peasants, merchants, minor gentry, The ceremony was simply tradition, a community celebration of a new family beginning. Yet even for them, the lack of privacy must have been jarring. Medieval houses weren't built for privacy anyway. Peasant families often slept multiple people to a bed, children sharing space with parents, sometimes even with livestock nearby for warmth. Wealthy households had servants sleeping in their masters' bedrooms, always within earshot. Privacy as we understand it today, the ability to be truly alone, to close a door and know no one will enter, simply didn't exist for most medieval people. So perhaps the bedding ceremony wasn't as shocking to them as it would be to us. Perhaps it was just another moment in a life lived always under the eyes of family, neighbours, and community. Still, there must have been couples who longed for solitude, who wished they could begin their married life without an audience. Medieval literature gives us glimpses of this desire. Poets wrote of lovers stealing away to secret places, gardens, empty chapels, forest clearings, seeking the privacy denied them in their own homes. There's a certain irony here. The church, which orchestrated these public bedding ceremonies, also preached that sex should be approached with shame and restraint, that pleasure was sinful, that the body was a source of temptation. Yet here they were, making the marriage bed a public stage, ensuring that an entire community witnessed, or at least acknowledged, the sexual act about to occur. The contradiction seems almost comic until you remember the cold logic behind it. Control. By making the wedding night a public event, the church and society maintained control over marriage, over legitimacy, over property and power, and this was only the beginning. Once the witnesses finally left and the bed curtains closed, medieval couples faced another daunting reality. The church hadn't just controlled their wedding night. It had rules, endless, intricate, suffocating rules about when they could touch each other, how they could touch each other, even why they could touch each other. The bedroom door might finally be closed, but the church's authority remained inside that room, dictating every intimate detail of married life. But that's a story for what comes next. For now, rest in the knowledge that however complicated your own relationships might feel, at least you don't have to endure your wedding night with 6 witnesses, a priest with holy water, and your future in-laws throwing their stockings at your head. Medieval couples did, and somehow miraculously, they survived. Though one has to wonder how many of them lay awake that first night listening to the footsteps fade away, finally alone, and thought, is this really what we signed up for? The answer, as we'll discover, was far more complicated than they could have imagined. Because if they thought the bedding ceremony was intrusive, they were in for a shock when they learned about the church's calendar of sin, a labyrinth of forbidden days that would determine exactly when they could and couldn't express their love. And trust me, you won't believe how restricted their options truly were. So you've survived the bedding ceremony. The witnesses have finally departed, the priest has finished his blessings, and at long last, you're alone with your spouse. You reach for each other in the candlelight, ready to begin your married life. But wait, what day is it? Is it Sunday? Stop right there. Is it Wednesday? Forbidden. Thursday? Absolutely not. Friday? Don't even think about it. Saturday? That's a sin too. You see, in medieval Europe, the church didn't just control your wedding night. It controlled every night thereafter, dictating exactly when you could and couldn't express physical love to your own husband or wife. Welcome to the calendar of sin, where romance went to die and spontaneity became heresy. Let me paint you a picture of what married life actually looked like under these rules. Imagine you're a medieval couple. Let's call you Thomas and Margaret. You married in January and you're genuinely in love, which makes you fortunate. Most marriages were arranged, but you actually chose each other. You're living in a small English village, working hard every day, and naturally you want to enjoy the physical intimacy that marriage permits. Surely that's allowed now, right? You've done everything properly, the church wedding, the bedding ceremony, the blessings. Now you can finally be together whenever you wish. Except you can't. Not even close. The church had created an elaborate system of forbidden days that would make your head spin. Let's start with the weekly restrictions. According to the penitential handbooks, those instruction manuals priests use to assign penances for sins, married couples could only have relations on certain days of the week. Monday, yes, that's acceptable. Tuesday, also permitted. Wednesday, no, that's out. Why? Because Wednesday was a traditional fast day. Thursday, forbidden, because it commemorated the Last Supper. Friday, absolutely not. That's the day Christ died. For heaven's sake. Saturday? No again, in preparation for Sunday, and Sunday. Well, Sunday was the Lord's Day, the holiest day of the week. Having marital relations on Sunday was practically sacrilege. Do you see what's happening here? Out of 7 days in a week, you've got maybe 2 or 3 when the church gave you permission to touch your own spouse. That's it. 2 or 3 days, and we haven't even gotten to the seasonal restrictions yet. The Penitential Handbook of Finian, written in the 6th century by an Irish monk, specified that married couples must abstain during 3 40-day periods each year. 3 40-day periods. Let's do the math on that, shall we? That's 120 days right there, nearly 4 months of the year when sex was completely off limits. These periods were Lent, the 40 days before Easter, when all Christians were supposed to fast and pray. Then Advent, the 40 days before Christmas, another season of spiritual preparation. And finally Whitsuntide, the period following Pentecost, 120 days of mandatory abstinence. But wait, there's more. The Church also forbade marital relations during all feast days, and medieval Catholicism had a lot of feast days. Saints' days, holy days of obligation, local religious festivals. The calendar was packed with them. Some scholars estimate there were anywhere from 60 to 100 feast days per year when sex was prohibited. Suddenly, those 2 or 3 available weekdays per week are looking even more restricted. And we still haven't discussed the most intimate restrictions of all, those related to a woman's body and reproductive cycle. The Church taught that women became ritually unclean during menstruation. This wasn't just a medieval Christian invention, it drew heavily from ancient Jewish purity laws. But medieval Christianity took it to new extremes. When a woman was menstruating, not only was marital sex forbidden, but some church authorities argued she shouldn't even enter a church. Theodore of Tarsus, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 7th century, ruled that menstruating women who entered a church had committed a sin requiring penance. The restrictions didn't end with menstruation. Once a woman became pregnant, which was, remember, the entire point of marital sex according to the Church, relations were supposed to cease. Some authorities said couples should abstain for the entire 9 months of pregnancy. Others were slightly more lenient, suggesting abstinence only during the final 3 months. Either way, pregnancy meant months more of required celibacy. Then came childbirth. After giving birth, a woman was considered unclean for 40 days. 40 days of mandatory abstinence while she recovered. If she had given birth to a son, some texts specified 33 days of abstinence, supposedly because Christ was circumcised on the 8th day and then presented at the temple 33 days later. If she had given birth to a daughter, the unclean period doubled to 66 days. The sexism is breathtaking, isn't it? Even a newborn girl's presence made her mother somehow more contaminated than a newborn boy would. And if the woman chose to breastfeed her baby, which most women did because wet nurses were expensive and rare, the abstinence continued. The Church taught that sex while nursing could contaminate the breast milk, potentially harming the infant. So for the entire duration of nursing, which could easily last 2 years or more, couples were expected to remain celibate. Let's pause and add this all up. Imagine you're Margaret, our hypothetical medieval wife. You menstruate roughly once a month for about 5 days. That's 60 days per year forbidden. You get pregnant, 9 months of abstinence. You give birth, 40 more days forbidden, minimum. You nurse your baby for 2 years. That's 2 years of celibacy. By the time you're done nursing, you might get pregnant again, and the cycle starts over. Between pregnancies, nursing, menstruation, and all those holy days, when exactly are you supposed to have marital relations? The answer, according to historians who've actually done the calculations, is shocking. The average married couple in medieval Europe, if they followed all the church's rules perfectly, could legally have sexual relations less than once per week. Some estimates put it even lower, perhaps 40 to 60 days per year, when sex was actually permitted. That's barely more than once a week, and that's only if you could coordinate those available days with your own desires, your work schedule and your physical health. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely people didn't actually follow all these rules, and you're right to wonder. The gap between what the church preached and what people actually practiced was probably enormous. We know this because the penitential handbooks themselves are evidence. If nobody was breaking these rules, priests wouldn't have needed detailed instructions on what penances to assign when they did, but the rules existed, and they were enforced through confession. Every good Christian was expected to confess their sins regularly, often before receiving communion, and these confessions weren't vague. The priest would ask specific questions guided by his penitential handbook. Did you have relations on Sunday? Did you touch your wife during her monthly courses? Did you engage in the marital act during Lent? Each sin had its assigned penance, usually fasting, prayer, or giving alms. Violate the rules too often or too seriously, and you could find yourself fasting on bread and water for days, weeks, even months. The psychological weight of this system must have been crushing. Imagine the anxiety of trying to track all these forbidden days. Is today a feast day? Did your wife's menstrual cycle start yesterday or the day before? Is it technically still Lent? Or has Easter finally arrived? And even if you managed to find an acceptable day, you still had to worry about your motivations, because the church taught that even on permitted days, having relations purely for pleasure was sinful. We'll dive deeper into that particular minefield later, but for now, just understand, even when sex was technically allowed, it came with spiritual guilt. Some medieval thinkers recognized how absurd this was becoming. There are records of debates among theologians about whether these restrictions were too harsh, whether they were driving people away from the church rather than toward holiness. By the 12th century, some canonists, experts in church law, began arguing for fewer restrictions. Gratian, the Italian monk whose legal textbook became the foundation of church law, reduced some of the prohibited days in his writings around 1140. He acknowledged that the older, stricter rules were creating more problems than they solved. But the damage was done. For centuries, medieval couples had internalized the message that their own bodies, their own desires, their own marriages were somehow inherently sinful. That physical love, even within the sacred bond of matrimony, was something to be controlled, restricted, and approached with shame rather than joy. And here's what strikes me as particularly tragic. The church claimed these rules were about holiness, about keeping the spiritual separate from the carnal. But in practice, they created a culture of obsession. By making sex so forbidden, so regulated, so wrapped up in sin and penance, the church actually made people think about it constantly. Every married person had to be hyper-aware of the calendar, of their spouse's body, of which days were clean and which were unclean. The very thing the church claimed to want, less focus on physical desires, was undermined by its own intricate system of control. Can you imagine living this way? Can you picture yourself as Thomas or Margaret desperately trying to find a day when the stars aligned? When it wasn't Sunday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday or Saturday? When your wife wasn't menstruating or pregnant or nursing? When it wasn't Lent or Advent or Whitsuntide or some random saint's feast day you'd never even heard of, just so you could express love to your own spouse without committing a mortal sin? And yet people did live this way. They married, they had children, lots of children, which tells us they found time for intimacy despite the restrictions. They navigated this impossible system as best they could, probably breaking the rules far more often than they confessed, living with low-grade guilt as a constant companion. But the calendar of forbidden days was just the beginning of the church's control over the marriage bed. Because even when you finally found an acceptable day, even when you'd navigated all the prohibitions and restrictions, you still weren't free to express love however you wished. Oh no. The church had very specific ideas about how married couples could and couldn't touch each other. They had rules about positions, about acts, about what parts of the body were acceptable and what constituted depravity, and those rules were enforced with penances so severe they could make a grown man weep. You've finally found an acceptable day. You've checked the calendar twice. It's Tuesday, not a feast day, not Lent, not Advent. Your wife isn't menstruating, she's not pregnant, she's not nursing. Against all odds, the stars have aligned. You're both exhausted from a long day of medieval labour, but you're determined to seize this rare opportunity for intimacy. You close the door to your sleeping chamber, or at least you draw the curtain around your bed, because privacy is still largely a fantasy. You reach for each other in the darkness, and then, just as things begin, a horrifying thought strikes you. Are we doing this correctly? Are we positioned in the only way the church permits? Because if we're not, everything we're about to do becomes a mortal sin, regardless of which day it is. Welcome to perhaps the most invasive aspect of church control over medieval marriage, the regulation of sexual positions. Yes, you heard that right. The medieval church didn't just tell you when you could make love, it told you exactly how you could do it. And the penalties for getting it wrong were severe enough to make you think twice before trying anything remotely creative. The church's position on positions was brutally simple. There was one acceptable way and one way only. They called it the natural position, the proper position, the only position that aligned with God's design for procreation. We know it today as the missionary position, man on top, woman on bottom, face to face. Anything else was labelled contra naturam, against nature, and therefore sinful. But why? What made this particular configuration so holy that all others became heresies? The logic, such as it was, came down to medieval understandings of reproduction and divine order. Church theologians believed that the missionary position provided the best angle for conception. Gravity would work in your favour, they reasoned. The seed would be more likely to find its target and fulfill its procreative purpose. Any other position might waste the seed, spilling it where it couldn't create life. And since the sole justification for marital sex was procreation, anything that reduced the chance of pregnancy was spiritually suspicious. But there was more to it than just mechanics. The missionary position reinforced what the church saw as the natural hierarchy of creation. Man above, woman below, man active, woman passive, man as the rational spiritual being, woman as the emotional, physical creature. To reverse these positions, to put woman on top for instance, was to invert God's established order. It was to suggest that women could dominate men, that the natural hierarchy could be overturned. And if that could happen in the bedroom, what chaos might follow in the household, in society, in the church itself? The penitential handbook spelled out the prohibitions with startling specificity. The Penitential of Theodore, written in the 7th century, is particularly detailed. It assigns different penances for different sexual positions, creating a hierarchy of sinfulness. Let's break this down, because the medieval mind truly went to extraordinary lengths to categorize every conceivable variation. First, there was what they called mor ferarum, which translates to in the manner of beasts. This meant any position where the man approached from behind, the way animals mate. The church found this particularly offensive because it suggested humans were no better than animals, abandoning their rational nature for base instinct. A couple caught confessing to this sin, and yes, you were supposed to confess such things, might face a penance of 3 years. 3 years. For what? For a position that millions of married couples throughout history have found perfectly natural and enjoyable. Then there was the dreaded woman on top position. This was seen as especially problematic because it inverted the proper order of things. Some theologians argued it was less sinful than mor ferarum, because at least the couple was face to face, maintaining some human dignity. But others considered it worse precisely because of that inversion of hierarchy. The penance could range from 40 days to 3 years, depending on which penitential handbook your priest consulted and how shocked he was by your confession. Standing positions? Forbidden. The seed might spill more easily, they reasoned, reducing the chance of conception. Sitting positions? Also forbidden, for the same reason. Side-by-side positions, technically less sinful than some alternatives, but still discouraged because they didn't conform to the natural hierarchy. Essentially, if you weren't lying down with the husband on top, you were probably sinning. Now let's talk about the truly severe prohibitions, the acts that medieval churchmen considered so depraved they could barely bring themselves to name them. Oral sex was classified as one of the worst evils a married couple could commit. The Penitential of Theodore calls it the worst of evils, worse even than some forms of adultery or fornication. Why? Because it absolutely could not lead to procreation. It was sex purely for pleasure with no possible reproductive purpose. Couples who confessed to this were assigned penances that could last 7 to 15 years. Some penitentials suggested the penance should last to the end of life, meaning you'd spend the rest of your earthly existence atoning for that one act. The same applied to any form of manual stimulation that led to male climax outside the woman's body. The seed was sacred. It contained potential life, they believed, and to waste it was to commit a crime against creation itself. This is where we encounter one of the most infamous legends of medieval sexuality, the chemise cagoule, or the nightshirt with a hole in it. According to popular myth, some medieval couples wore these special nightgowns that covered their entire bodies except for a strategically placed opening, allowing for procreative intercourse while minimizing sinful skin-to-skin contact. Now, historians have searched for centuries and found almost no actual evidence that these garments existed or were ever widely used. But the fact that the legend persists tells us something important. It captures the medieval mindset perfectly. The idea that even within marriage, even during the one permitted sexual act, the body should be hidden, shame should be maintained, and pleasure should be minimized. That was the ideal the church promoted. But here's where things get truly fascinating, and by fascinating I mean horrifying. The church knew these rules were difficult to follow. They knew married couples would struggle, so they didn't just create prohibitions, they created detailed interrogation protocols for confession. Priests were given specific questions to ask married penitents to determine whether they'd sinned in these ways. However, and this is crucial, the church also recognized a problem. If a priest asked too explicitly, about various sexual positions and acts, he might inadvertently give parishioners ideas. Imagine going to confession having only ever known the missionary position, and suddenly your priest is describing all these other possibilities while asking if you've tried them. Congratulations, you've just learned several new sins you didn't even know existed, and now you're curious about them. So confessors were advised to be vague. Instead of naming specific acts, they might ask questions like, "Have you known your wife other than as nature demands?" Or, "Have you engaged in unnatural acts with your spouse?" The penitent was supposed to understand what was being asked without the priest having to spell it out. If the person genuinely didn't understand the question, some handbooks suggested the priest should simply move on. Better to let some sins go unconfessed than to educate people about new ways to transgress. This created a bizarre situation where the severity of your penance could depend entirely on how explicit your confession was. If you vaguely admitted to unnatural acts without specifying what they were, your priest might assign a lighter penance, uncertain of the details. But if you described exactly what you'd done, and some penitents, overwhelmed with guilt, did exactly that, you might face the maximum penalty. Let's consider a real example from the medieval court records. In 1368, a case came before the ecclesiastical court in York involving a married couple accused by their neighbour of making shameful noises at night. The neighbour had apparently been scandalised by what she'd heard through the thin walls of their adjoining houses. The couple was called before the court to explain themselves. Now, the court records don't specify exactly what the couple confessed to, but they were assigned a penance of 60 days of fasting, which suggests they admitted to something beyond simple missionary position intercourse. 60 days, 2 months of eating only bread and water, weakening their bodies and their ability to work, all because they'd explored their own marriage bed in ways the church deemed improper. Think about the anxiety this system created. Every time you made love to your own spouse, you had to constantly monitor yourself. Are we in the right position? Did we maintain the proper hierarchy? Did we allow any pleasure to distract us from the procreative purpose? And if you slipped, if in a moment of passion you tried something different, something that felt natural and loving, you carried that guilt until your next confession, where you'd have to humiliate yourself before a priest and accept whatever penance he deemed appropriate. Some medieval writers tried to find loopholes. They argued that certain variations might be acceptable as foreplay, as long as the actual climax and release of seed occurred in the proper position. This led to elaborate theological debates about exactly when an act crossed the line from permissible preparation into impermissible sin. Could a husband stimulate his wife to pleasure before assuming the proper position? Some said yes, as long as he didn't bring her to climax. Others said no, because any pleasure not directly tied to procreation was suspect. The amount of intellectual energy medieval churchmen devoted to these questions is staggering. And here's something I find particularly telling. These regulations applied equally to young newlyweds and to elderly couples who could no longer conceive. That's right. Even if you were past childbearing age, even if your wife had gone through menopause and pregnancy was impossible, you were still expected to maintain these rules. The missionary position remained mandatory. Why? Because at that point it wasn't even about procreation anymore. It was about control. It was about maintaining the hierarchy. It was about ensuring that even in your most private moments you remembered the church's authority over your body and your marriage. The question that haunts me is, how many medieval couples actually followed these rules? We'll never know for certain, of course. What happened behind bed curtains stayed behind bed curtains, unless someone felt guilty enough to confess, or unless nosy neighbours reported suspicious sounds. But the very existence of these detailed regulations, repeated across centuries in penitential after penitential, suggests that people were breaking them regularly enough to require constant reinforcement. Human nature doesn't change that much across the centuries. Married couples in love, comfortable with each other, exploring physical intimacy together, they're going to discover variations naturally. They're going to find what feels good and brings them closer together. The church could label these discoveries as sins, could threaten penances and divine punishment, but it couldn't change the fundamental human desire for connection and pleasure. Still, the guilt must have been crushing for conscientious believers. Imagine loving your spouse deeply, wanting to express that love physically, but constantly wondering if you were damning yourself in the process. Imagine the fear of confessing these intimacies to your priest, who might be your neighbor or your wife's cousin, and knowing he'd forever after see you differently. But if you think regulating positions was invasive, wait until you hear about the comprehensive system the church created to monitor every aspect of marital sexuality. They literally created flowcharts, decision trees, that medieval people were supposed to follow before every intimate encounter. And trust me, by the time you'd checked every box and satisfied every requirement, whatever passion you'd started with was probably long gone. There's a document that has become legendary among medieval historians, something so absurdly detailed and yet so perfectly representative of the church's mindset that when you first see it, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. It's a flowchart. Yes, an actual flowchart, compiled by Professor James Brundage from the University of Kansas, who spent years studying medieval penitential handbooks. He took all those scattered rules, all those prohibitions and conditions, and organized them into a single decision tree. The result? A visual representation of exactly what a medieval married person had to mentally process before having intimate relations with their spouse. And I promise you, once you understand this flowchart, you'll never take modern sexual freedom for granted again. Picture yourself as a medieval husband or wife. It's evening. The work is done, the children are asleep, or at least they're on the other side of the room because remember, privacy barely exists. You feel that natural desire for your spouse, but before you act on it, you need to run through the checklist. Not a simple checklist, mind you. We're talking about a maze of conditions, each one a potential stop sign, each one capable of transforming your natural marital affection into a mortal sin. Let's walk through this together, shall we? Think of it as a medieval game of sexual red light, green light, except the consequences for getting it wrong aren't just embarrassment, they're eternal damnation. Question 1. What day is it? If it's Sunday, stop immediately. That's the Lord's Day. Having relations on Sunday, even with your spouse, shows a lack of reverence for God. If you proceed, you're looking at a penance of 1 to 3 days of fasting. Not so bad, you might think, until you remember that this is just the first question. But let's say it's not Sunday. Let's say it's Monday. Excellent. We can move forward. Oh, but wait, is it a feast day? Is it St. Benedict's feast or St. Martin's or one of the dozens of other holy days scattered throughout the medieval calendar? If yes, stop sin. If no, congratulations, you've passed the first hurdle. Question 2. What season is it? Are we in Lent, that 40-day period of fasting and penance before Easter? If yes, stop. Absolutely forbidden. The Church expected total abstinence during Lent, no exceptions. Are we in Advent, the 40 days before Christmas? Stop again. What about Whitsuntide, the period after Pentecost? Yes, that's forbidden too. And let's not forget Easter week itself, or the other holy seasons. Assuming you're not in any of these forbidden periods, and remember, that's 120 days of the year right there, you can proceed to the next question. Question 3. Let's talk about your wife's body. Is she currently menstruating? If yes, stop immediately. Menstrual blood was considered ritually unclean, contaminating. Having relations during menstruation wasn't just a sin. It was believed to potentially harm any children conceived during that time. Medieval medical texts claim that babies conceived during menstruation would be born with birth defects, red hair, or worse, leprosy. The penance for this sin could be severe, anywhere from 15 days to several months of fasting, depending on your confessor's interpretation. But let's say she's not menstruating. Good. Next question. Is she pregnant? If yes, you need to stop. Authorities said any sex during pregnancy was forbidden. Others were more lenient, allowing it during the first 6 months but forbidding it during the last 3. The reasoning was twofold. First, sex might harm the developing child, and second, since the woman was already pregnant, there was no procreative purpose to the act. Remember, procreation was the only legitimate reason for marital sex. If you can't make a baby, you shouldn't be trying. Assuming she's not pregnant either, we move to the next condition. Has she recently given birth? If yes, you must wait 40 days if she had a boy, 66 days if she had a girl. Yes, the gender of the baby affected how long you had to abstain. The logic was tied to those ancient purity laws we mentioned earlier. Women were considered more contaminated after giving birth to a daughter than to a son. Don't ask me to make it make sense, it's medieval theology. Is she breastfeeding? If yes, many authorities said you should abstain for the entire duration of nursing, which could be 2 years or more. The belief was that sexual relations would somehow contaminate the breast milk, harming the infant. Other authorities were slightly more lenient, but even they recommended limited relations during nursing periods. Now, assuming you've made it through all these questions about your wife's biological state, and honestly, the odds are not in your favour, we can move to questions about timing and intention. Is it currently daytime? If yes, stop. Sex during daylight hours was considered inappropriate, lacking in the shame and discretion that should accompany even marital relations. The medieval church believed that darkness was appropriate for such acts, hiding them from view as one hides something inherently shameful. Here's where it gets even more psychologically invasive. What is your intention? Why do you want to have relations with your spouse? If your answer is because I desire pleasure, congratulations, you've just admitted to a sin. Even within marriage, even on a permitted day, even in the proper position, sex motivated primarily by pleasure was considered sinful. The only truly virtuous reasons were, first, to procreate, to fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply. Second, to render the conjugal debt, meaning your spouse has requested it and you're fulfilling your marital obligation. Or third, to avoid the temptation of fornication or adultery, meaning you're channeling your lust into the legitimate outlet of the marriage rather than seeking illicit satisfaction elsewhere. But what if you wanted to have relations for multiple reasons? What if you genuinely hoped to conceive a child but also, let's be honest, expected to enjoy the experience? The theologians actually debated this extensively. Some said mixed motivations were acceptable as long as procreation was the primary intent. Others said any hint of pleasure-seeking tainted the act. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval philosopher and theologian, argued that pleasure wasn't sinful in itself. It was God's design to make procreation appealing, but seeking pleasure as the main goal, rather than as a side effect of procreation, crossed the line into sin. Can you imagine the mental gymnastics required here? You're supposed to want sex enough to actually do it, but not want it too much. You're allowed to enjoy it, but not to seek that enjoyment. You must approach it with the right mixture of duty and reluctant acceptance. It's like trying to walk a tightrope while juggling flaming torches and reciting Latin prayers. Let's assume miraculously that you've passed all these tests. It's a permitted day, the right season, your wife isn't menstruating or pregnant or nursing or recovering from childbirth, it's nighttime, and your intentions are technically pure. You've made it through the flowchart. you can proceed. But wait, there's one more layer of complexity we haven't fully addressed. How many times the church taught that married couples should have relations only once per encounter? Going for a second round, even on the same permitted night, was considered excessive, motivated by lust rather than procreation. After all, one act should be sufficient to achieve conception if that's truly your goal. Wanting more suggested you were in it for the pleasure. Some penitentials assigned specific penances for couples who had relations multiple times in one night, usually a few days of fasting. But the guilt and humiliation of confessing such excess must have been punishment enough for many. Now, here's what I find particularly striking about this elaborate system. It required medieval people to be constantly obsessively aware of their own sexuality and their spouse's body. The church claimed to want people to think less about sex, to be more spiritual and less carnal. But in practice, this system made sex an all-consuming preoccupation. You couldn't just naturally respond to your spouse's affection. You had to calculate, analyze, remember what day it was, track your wife's menstrual cycle, monitor your own motivations, and worry constantly about whether you'd committed a sin. The penitential handbooks give us glimpses of how this played out in real confessions. Priests were trained to ask careful questions, and the manuals provided sample dialogues. "My son," a priest might say, "did you know your wife on a forbidden day?" If the penitent said yes, the priest would dig deeper. Was it a Sunday? Was she in her monthly courses? Did you do this more than once? Each answer led to a different penance. But here's the fascinating part, and this is where we see the gap between theory and practice. Priests were also given guidance on when to be lenient. If a man confessed that he'd had relations with his wife on a Sunday, but it was his wedding night, some manuals suggested the priest should be merciful. The couple was newly married, passions were high, they didn't know better. Assign a light penance and move on. Similarly, if a couple confessed to having relations while the wife was nursing, but they were trying to conceive another child quickly because infant mortality was so high and they desperately wanted living heirs, some priests might look the other way. This flexibility reveals something important. Even the church authorities recognized that their own rules were, at times, impossibly strict. They built in escape valves, ways for conscientious believers to navigate the system without completely destroying their marriages or their sanity. But that flexibility also created inconsistency. Your penance might depend entirely on which priest heard your confession, what mood he was in that day, and how sympathetically he viewed your particular situation. There's a certain dark comedy in all of this. Imagine a medieval husband running through this flowchart in his head while lying next to his wife. Okay, it's Tuesday. That's good. Not Lent, not Advent, not a feast day. She's not menstruating, I check the calendar. Not pregnant, at least not yet. Not nursing anymore, thank God. It's night time. My intentions are, well, mostly procreative. Mostly. We haven't done this in 3 weeks because the last 3 Tuesdays were all feast days. This might be our only chance this month. Okay, we can do this, but remember, missionary position only, don't enjoy it too much, and definitely only once. Here we go. By the time you've finished this mental checklist, I'd wager, whatever romantic feeling you started with has completely evaporated, replaced by anxiety and mathematical calculation. How many medieval couples lay in bed, wanting to express love to each other, but paralyzed by fear of sinning? How many marriages suffered because spontaneity and natural affection were crushed under the weight of ecclesiastical regulation? And yet, medieval people persevered. They had children, lots of them. Parish records show that even with all these restrictions, babies were born in every season, suggesting that couples found ways to navigate the rules, or perhaps simply ignored them more often than the church would have liked. The very fact that the penitential handbooks kept being written, updated and copied throughout the medieval period suggests that people kept breaking the rules, kept needing to confess, kept requiring penance. But the psychological toll must have been immense. Every married person carried the knowledge that their most intimate moments were being judged by an invisible divine observer, catalogued by their priest, and weighed against an impossibly complex set of regulations. The marriage bed, which should have been a sanctuary of love and connection, became instead a minefield of potential sins. And we haven't even talked about the most insidious rule of all, the one that said even if you did everything right, checked every box, followed every regulation perfectly, you could still sin if you enjoyed it too much. Because pleasure, my friends, was the real enemy in the church's eyes. Not marital sex itself, but the pleasure that came with it. And that's where things get truly twisted. Here's the ultimate paradox at the heart of medieval sexuality, the contradiction that would drive anyone mad if they thought about it too long. The church insisted that married couples must have sexual relations. It was a duty, an obligation, part of what they called the conjugal debt. But at the same time, the church taught that enjoying those relations was sinful. Let that sink in for a moment. You were required to do something, but forbidden from deriving pleasure from it. It's like being ordered to eat a delicious meal while simultaneously being told that tasting the food makes you a sinner. How do you even begin to navigate that kind of cognitive dissonance? This is where medieval theology reached its most twisted, most psychologically damaging extreme, and it all stems from a single, deeply problematic idea that pleasure itself, physical pleasure, sensory enjoyment, the body's natural responses, was inherently tainted by sin. Not just sexual pleasure, mind you, though that was considered the worst kind, all pleasure. But since we're talking about marriage, let's focus on how this belief poisoned the one relationship where physical intimacy was supposedly sanctioned by God himself. The architect of much of this thinking was St. Augustine of Hippo, that brilliant tormented theologian from the 4th and 5th centuries who shaped Christian thought on sexuality for the next 1,000 years. Augustine had a complicated past. Before his conversion to Christianity, he'd lived with a concubine for 15 years, fathered a child with her, and by his own admission, struggled constantly with sexual desire. When he finally embraced Christianity and celibacy, he brought with him an intense suspicion of the body and its urges. He couldn't simply say that sex outside marriage was wrong while sex within marriage was good. No, for Augustine, even marital sex was tainted, made necessary by the fall of Adam and Eve, but never truly pure. Augustine developed what historians call a theology of concession. Marriage, he argued, was a concession to human weakness. God knew that most people couldn't maintain lifelong celibacy like the saints and clergy were supposed to, so he permitted marriage as a controlled outlet for the sexual urges that would otherwise lead to fornication and adultery. But this didn't make marital sex virtuous. It merely made it less sinful than the alternatives. Think about that for a moment. Your wedding night, that supposedly sacred beginning of your marital union, was really just God's way of preventing you from doing something even worse. This worldview led to some truly bizarre theological positions. The most famous or infamous comes from St. Jerome, another early church father writing in the late 4th century. Jerome declared, and I'm translating his Latin carefully here, "He who is too ardent a lover of his own wife is an adulterer." Read that again. You could commit adultery with your own wife, not by sleeping with someone else while married to her. No, by wanting her too much, by loving her too passionately, by desiring her body with too much enthusiasm. Your own wife, the woman you'd lawfully married, wanting her too badly made you an adulterer. How does that even work logically? Well, according to Jerome and those who followed his thinking, marriage had one purpose: procreation. When you approached your wife, you should be thinking about creating children to populate God's kingdom, not about your own gratification. If your primary motivation was desire, if you sought pleasure rather than pregnancy, then you are treating your wife no better than a prostitute, using her body for your own enjoyment rather than for the sacred purpose of reproduction. Thomas Aquinas, the towering intellectual figure of the 13th century, refined this idea further. Aquinas was more moderate than some early church fathers. He acknowledged that pleasure had a role in God's design. After all, if sex were completely unpleasant, how would anyone ever procreate? God must have attached pleasure to the act to ensure humans would fulfill their reproductive duty. But, and this is crucial, the pleasure was meant to be a means to an end, not the end itself. You could experience pleasure incidentally, as a side effect of pursuing procreation, but you couldn't seek it as your primary goal. Aquinas used an analogy that medieval people would have understood: eating food. You must eat to survive, and God made food taste good so you'd be motivated to nourish your body. But if you ate solely for the taste, caring nothing for nutrition, that was the sin of gluttony. Similarly, you must have marital relations to procreate, and God made it pleasurable so you'd be motivated to do so. But if you sought relations solely for pleasure, caring nothing for procreation, that was the sin of lust, even within marriage. This created impossible standards. How were medieval couples supposed to monitor their own intentions and desires with such precision? When you reached for your spouse, how could you be certain your motivation was 90% procreation and only 10% pleasure? What if it was 50-50? What if, God forbid, it was 70% pleasure and only 30% procreation? At what point did you cross the line from acceptable to sinful? The penitential handbooks tried to provide guidance, but they only made things more confusing. The Penitential of Cumian, written in the 7th century in Ireland, specified different penances based on your level of desire. If you merely felt desire but didn't act on it inappropriately, that was a minor sin, maybe a week of penance. If you acted on desire during a forbidden time or in a forbidden way, the penance increased dramatically. But how were you supposed to confess the exact proportion of desire versus duty that motivated you? Father, forgive me, for I estimate that my desire accounted for approximately 63% of my motivation last Tuesday night. Some medieval theologians tried to split hairs even further. They distinguished between enjoying pleasure and suffering pleasure. Yes, you read that right, suffering pleasure. The idea was that you might experience physical pleasure during marital relations, but if you endured it with the proper spiritual attitude, recognizing it as a temptation, a weakness of the flesh, something to be tolerated rather than embraced, then perhaps it wasn't fully sinful. You should suffer through the pleasure, gritting your teeth spiritually, even while your body responded naturally. Can you imagine trying to maintain that mindset during intimate moments with your spouse? Thinking to yourself, I must endure this terrible pleasure. This physical sensation that my body is designed to experience is a trial sent by God to test my virtue. I will suffer through it righteously. It's almost comical, except for the genuine psychological damage it must have caused. The contradiction goes even deeper. Medieval medical knowledge, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman physicians, taught that female pleasure and orgasm were necessary for conception. The prevailing theory was that both men and women produced seed, and both seeds needed to be released for a child to be conceived. This meant that for procreation to occur, the very purpose the church claimed was the only justification for sex, the wife needed to experience pleasure and climax. So the church found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't condemn female pleasure entirely because doing so would undermine procreation itself. But they also couldn't encourage husbands to focus on their wives' pleasure because that would suggest pleasure was good and desirable. The solution? Awkward silence and theological tap dancing. Some authorities quietly acknowledge that husbands should ensure their wives experience satisfaction, but they framed it purely in terms of reproductive efficiency, not mutual enjoyment or emotional connection. This led to some darkly humorous situations in confession. A wife might confess to experiencing too much pleasure, worried that her enjoyment proved she wasn't sufficiently focused on procreation. The priest would have to carefully explain that some pleasure was acceptable, necessary even for conception to occur, but not too much pleasure. And certainly she shouldn't have sought that pleasure. She should have merely accepted it, endured it, been grateful for it while simultaneously being ashamed of it. The mental gymnastics required boggle the mind. Meanwhile, medical texts of the period offered completely different advice. Physicians working from Galenic and Hippocratic traditions wrote treatises explaining how husbands could help their wives achieve satisfaction. They recommended extended foreplay, gentle stimulation, patience, and attentiveness. These medical manuals were purely practical, focused on health and reproduction, unconcerned with the moral qualifications the Church imposed. A husband consulting a physician might receive explicit advice on techniques to pleasure his wife, while the same man consulting a priest might be told such focus on pleasure was spiritually dangerous. Medieval people had to somehow reconcile these contradictory authorities. Your doctor told you one thing, your priest another. Your body told you something else entirely. Your spouse's needs and your own desires added further complications, and over it all hung the spectre of sin, the fear that you were getting it wrong, that you'd face divine punishment for natural human responses to someone you loved. Let's consider how this played out in a real medieval marriage. Imagine William and Eleanor, married for 5 years, living in 14th century England. They love each other. They're fortunate in that regard. They've been trying to have children, but Eleanor hasn't yet conceived. The pressure is mounting from both families. They need an heir, so they follow all the rules carefully, only on permitted days, only in the permitted position, always with procreation as their stated intention. But here's the thing, they enjoy being together. They find pleasure in each other's company and in physical intimacy. Does that pleasure make them sinners? According to strict church teaching, if that pleasure becomes their primary motivation, yes. But how can they possibly separate their desire to conceive from their desire to be close to each other? And should they even try? Wouldn't emotional warmth and genuine affection make conception more likely? Wouldn't coldly mechanical, duty-focused intercourse be less effective? These questions weren't merely theoretical. Medieval couples grappled with them constantly. And the Church's answer was essentially, yes, you're probably sinning, but if procreation results, God will forgive the sin that enabled it. In other words, the ends justify the means, but you should still feel guilty about the means. This created a culture of sexual shame that persisted for centuries. Even good Christian couples who followed all the rules, who never committed adultery or fornication, who remained faithful and devoted to each other, still carried guilt about their own marriage beds. They worried that they'd enjoyed themselves too much, that their affection for their spouse had tipped into lust, that their natural physical responses proved their spiritual weakness. And God forbid, literally, if a wife actually initiated intimacy. A woman who expressed desire for her husband was immediately suspect. Was she being too carnal, too lustful? Was she thinking about procreation or pleasure? The ideal wife was supposed to be passively receptive, accepting her husband's advances as part of her duty, but never seeking relations herself. Any show of enthusiasm or initiative marked her as potentially sinful. Yet the Church also taught about the conjugal debt, the obligation spouses had to provide sexual relations when the other requested them. Both husbands and wives could make this request, and both had a duty to fulfill it. But how do you request without showing desire? How do you make your needs known without appearing too eager? Medieval people had to walk this impossible tightrope, wanting but not wanting too much, asking but not too enthusiastically, enjoying but not too obviously. Saint Augustine himself admitted that even he, with all his theological training and spiritual discipline, couldn't fully eliminate pleasure from the act of generation. He wrote that the pleasure was so intense, so overwhelming in the moment, that it briefly darkened the rational mind. And that loss of rational control, even momentarily, was proof of sin's continuing power over human nature. So even Augustine, the great architect of this theology, essentially admitted the system was impossible to follow perfectly. But if Augustine couldn't manage it, what hope did ordinary medieval couples have? None, really. They were set up to fail, to carry perpetual guilt about one of the most fundamental aspects of their marriages. And that, I think, was partly the point. The Church maintained control over people's lives by ensuring they always felt inadequate, always in need of confession, absolution, and priestly guidance. If you could never be quite certain you were doing things right, you'd keep coming back to the Church for reassurance and penance. The tragedy is that this theology damaged countless marriages. It made spouses afraid of each other, afraid of their own bodies, afraid of the connection that should have been a source of joy and strength. It replaced warmth with calculation, spontaneity with fear, and love with duty. All in the name of controlling something the Church could never truly control: human nature itself. But as crushing as the pleasure problem was, as psychologically damaging as this constant guilt must have been, it still wasn't the most humiliating aspect of Church control over medieval marriages, because at least these rules were enforced through private confession, through the discretion of the confessional box. But when a marriage faced certain problems, particularly when a husband's ability was questioned, the Church wasn't content with private resolution. Oh no, they took it public, they took it to court. And what happened there was so mortifying, so invasive, that it makes everything we've discussed so far seem almost tame by comparison. What if I told you that in medieval and early modern Europe, a wife could drag her husband into court and force him to prove his sexual capability before an audience of physicians, priests, and matrons? What if I told you that some men were required to achieve an erection on command in front of witnesses to save their marriages and reputations? And what if I told you that in the most extreme cases, couples were ordered to have sexual intercourse in front of a panel of experts who would then file a detailed report on their performance? You might think I'm exaggerating, making up scandalous stories for entertainment, but every word of this is documented historical fact. Welcome to the world of impotence trials, where the most private failures became the most public humiliations. The logic behind these trials was brutally simple. According to medieval church law, a valid marriage required the ability to consummate. If a husband couldn't perform his marital duties, the marriage could be annulled, declared invalid as if it had never existed. This wasn't just about sex, it was about legitimacy, inheritance, family alliances, and property rights. A marriage without consummation was a marriage without purpose, because remember, the whole point of marriage was procreation. No consummation meant no children, which meant no heirs, which meant the entire social and economic structure built around that marriage crumbled. For women, these trials represented one of the very few legal pathways to escape an unhappy or unconsummated marriage. Divorce as we understand it didn't really exist in medieval Catholic Europe. Once you were married, you stayed married until death, with only the rarest exceptions. But impotence? That was grounds for annulment. It meant the marriage had never been valid in the first place. So for a woman trapped in a loveless union, or married to a man she found incompatible, or simply desperate to remarry someone else, accusing her husband of impotence became a strategic option. But the process of proving impotence was so degrading, so invasive, so utterly mortifying that it must have given everyone involved pause. Let's walk through what actually happened in these trials, starting with the English ecclesiastical courts in the 14th century. The year is 1370. A woman named Tedia Lampeard has been married to John Sanderson for 3 years, and the marriage has not been consummated. She claims John is physically incapable. John denies it, but Tedia is adamant. She brings her complaint before the church court in York, the ecclesiastical court that handled all matters of marriage and morality. The court takes the accusation seriously. This isn't just a private marital dispute. If Tedia is telling the truth, she has grounds for annulment. So the court orders an examination, but not by physicians, not by learned medical men. No, the examination is conducted by what the court records call honest women, usually 3 matrons, women of good reputation who had experience with marriage and childbirth. These women were considered qualified to assess male anatomy and sexual function. Why women rather than male doctors? Perhaps because male doctors might be too sympathetic to a fellow man. Perhaps because these matrons had intimate knowledge from their own marriages. Or perhaps simply because this was considered women's business, too delicate for men to handle. The matrons took John into a private room and conducted their examination. What exactly happened in that room, we can only imagine from the clinical report they filed afterward. And this report, preserved in the York Court records, is so detailed, so unflinchingly explicit, that reading it today still feels like a violation of John's privacy. The matrons reported that the member of the said John is like an empty intestine of mottled skin and without any substance, veins, or sinew. They examined it thoroughly, they touched it, they tried to stimulate a response. Nothing. The member, they concluded, was useless for marital purposes. Based on this testimony, the court granted Tedia an annulment. John's failure was now a matter of public record. Everyone in their community would know why the marriage ended. Can you imagine the shame, the whispers behind his back, the jokes at the market? John's inability to perform had been documented, certified, and announced by the ecclesiastical authorities. But John's humiliation pales in comparison to another case from just 2 years later, also in York. A man whose name is lost to history was brought before the same court on similar charges. His wife claimed he couldn't fulfill his marital duties. The man protested that he was perfectly capable, so the court appointed matrons to examine him to test whether he could achieve the necessary state of arousal. The matrons tried everything. According to the court records, they warmed his genitals by the fire, attempting to stimulate blood flow. They touched him, coaxed him, used every technique they knew. The man tried desperately to respond. His reputation, his marriage, his very manhood were at stake. But the report filed by the matrons was damning. He could scarcely raise it. Not completely incapable, but insufficient. The court sided with the wife, marriage annulled. These English trials were humiliating enough, but they were merely preludes to what developed in France during the 16th and 17th centuries. The French took impotence trials to a whole new level of invasiveness, with something called the trial by Congress. And no, that has nothing to do with politics. Congress in this context meant coming together. The physical union of husband and wife. And in a trial by Congress, that union had to happen before witnesses. Picture the scene. A husband accused of impotence, desperate to prove his capability, demands the right to undergo trial by Congress. He believes that if he can perform before witnesses, he'll be vindicated, his reputation restored. The court agrees. A date is set. The location is prepared, sometimes a room in the courthouse, sometimes a private chamber rented for the occasion, sometimes even a bathhouse. The witnesses gather, typically 5 physicians, 5 surgeons, and 5 matrons. 15 people, all there to observe this couple's most intimate act. The husband and wife are brought in. They are given some privacy to prepare. Perhaps they change into thin nightclothes behind a screen. They're offered wine or other substances believed to aid arousal. In some accounts, the matrons apply aphrodisiac ointments to the man. Everything possible is done to give him every advantage. Then the couple is placed in bed together, curtains drawn around them for minimal privacy, and the witnesses wait. The most famous trial by Congress involved René de Cordouan, the Marquis de Langeais, in 1657. The Marquis had been married to Marie de Saint-Simon for 4 years. By all accounts, the early years seemed happy. Marie wrote affectionate letters when they were apart. But then something changed. In 1657, Marie accused René of impotence, claiming their marriage had never been consummated. The initial examination seemed to support René's claim of potency. Physicians examined both spouses and concluded that the Marquis appeared physically normal and that Marie was not a virgin, suggesting consummation had occurred. But Marie protested. She claimed that if she wasn't a virgin, it was only because René had made crude, brutal attempts that barely counted as proper intercourse. He was, she insisted, fundamentally inadequate. Stung by this accusation, humiliated by the public questioning of his manhood, the Marquis made a fateful decision. He demanded a trial by Congress. He would prove before God and witnesses that he was perfectly capable of consummating his marriage. It was, in retrospect, a terrible mistake. The trial became a sensation. All of Paris talked about it. People placed bets on the outcome. Society ladies gossiped about the Marquis, some expressing sympathy, others derision. One Madame d'Aulon reportedly declared, "I would so like to be condemned to trial by Congress," a joke that tells you how thoroughly the trial had become public entertainment. Pamphlets circulated with crude songs and jokes about the upcoming spectacle. The pressure on René was enormous. The day arrived. The Marquis and his estranged wife were brought to a luxurious bathhouse. Crowds gathered outside, hoping for gossip. Inside, the 15 official witnesses waited. René was confident, almost cocky. According to contemporary chronicler Tallemant de Réau, as René climbed into the bed, he shouted to the physicians, "Bring me 2 fresh eggs that I may get her a son at the first shot." Such bravado. Such confidence. But confidence wasn't enough. With his reputation at stake, with 15 pairs of eyes waiting, with the knowledge that his entire future depended on this performance, René's body failed him. The witnesses reported hearing grunting, cursing, and finally prayers. After 2 hours, 2 excruciating hours, René gave up, crying out in despair, "I'm ruined." The witnesses approached the bed with candles to inspect and verify the failure. Their report was clinical and merciless. No penetration had occurred. No emission of fluid, no consummation. The Marquis de Langeais had failed his trial by Congress. The marriage was annulled, and René's name became synonymous with impotence throughout France. His request for a retrial was denied. He was forbidden from remarrying. In the eyes of the law and the church, he was permanently branded as incapable. Here's the twist that makes this story almost unbearably tragic. René de Langeais later moved to the provinces, ignored the prohibition on remarriage, married again, and fathered 7 children with his second wife. 7 children. The man wasn't impotent at all. He'd simply been unable to perform under the most pressure-filled, humiliating circumstances imaginable. When one of his old enemies later mocked him about his supposed impotence, René proudly mentioned his 7 children. The enemy's response? "But sir, nobody has ever had any doubts about your wife." Even with proof of his capability, the stigma never left him. The Lange trial was so scandalous, so clearly unjust, that it contributed to the eventual abolition of trials by Congress. But that didn't happen until 1677, when King Louis XIV finally banned the practice as scandalous and absurd. For more than a century, French men had been subjected to this ultimate test, their most private capabilities made spectacularly public. But even before trials by Congress were banned, and even after, the examination of male impotence continued in less public but equally humiliating ways. Court records from across Europe document hundreds of cases where husbands were examined by physicians and matrons, where servants and neighbours were called to testify about what sounds they'd heard through bedroom walls, where the most intimate details of married life were dissected in legal proceedings. In 1603, a man named Jacques de Salles claimed his impotence was caused by witchcraft, an evil spell cast by his wife. The court granted the annulment, which tells you something about how seriously medieval and early modern people took magical explanations for sexual dysfunction. In 1712, the Marquis de Gevrey blamed his inability on an illness caused by eating an eel pie. The physicians concluded he had no physical defects, but couldn't confirm his virility, so they ruled in favour of the wife. These trials reveal something profoundly important about medieval and early modern attitudes toward masculinity. A man's worth, his very identity as a man, was inextricably tied to his sexual function. If he couldn't perform, he wasn't just failing as a husband, he was failing as a man. His property rights could be questioned, his honour was destroyed, his place in society became uncertain, and all of this could be exposed, examined, and judged in the most public, humiliating way possible. For women, these trials represented a double-edged sword. On one hand, they provided real agency, a way to escape marriages that weren't working, to seek annulments and potentially remarry. In a world where women had very few legal rights, the ability to bring an impotence suit was actual power. Wealthy women in particular used these trials strategically. The majority of recorded impotence cases involve aristocratic or wealthy merchant families, because only they could afford the legal costs and had enough property at stake to make the trial worthwhile. But on the other hand, pursuing such a trial required a woman to expose herself to scrutiny as well. She might be examined by male physicians to verify her virginity or lack thereof. Her testimony about her husband's failures meant discussing intimate details before male authorities. Her motives would be questioned. Was she really concerned about consummation, or was she simply trying to escape a marriage she found distasteful? And if she won, she was now branded as a woman whose husband couldn't satisfy her, which carried its own social stigma. The physicians, surgeons, and matrons who conducted these examinations left detailed records that make for both fascinating and uncomfortable reading. They described anatomy with clinical precision, noted every attempt to stimulate response, recorded failures with almost cruel specificity. These weren't prurient accounts written for titillation, they were legal documents, meant to provide the court with sufficient evidence to make a binding decision. But the level of detail they contained meant that anyone with access to court records could read about the most intimate failures of their neighbours and acquaintances. Think about what it meant to live in a society where this was normal, where your sexual capability could become a matter of public record and legal adjudication, where your most private inadequacies could be examined by strangers, documented in court files, and gossiped about in taverns and marketplaces. The psychological pressure must have been crushing. Every man knew that if his wife became dissatisfied, if she had financial or social reasons to seek an annulment, she could invoke the nuclear option, the impotence trial. And here's what really strikes me. The church and the legal system created this incredibly invasive, degrading process. in the name of protecting the sanctity of marriage and ensuring proper consummation. But in practice, it turned marriage into a performance evaluation, reduced men to their sexual function, and gave women a weapon to wield when other forms of agency were denied them. It was control masquerading as protection, invasion disguised as justice. The impotence trials finally faded away in the 18th century as attitudes shifted and as the growing movement for privacy rights made such public examinations seem increasingly barbaric. But they left a legacy. The idea that sexual performance could be legally tested, that intimate failures could have public consequences, that the state and church had the right to monitor and judge private capability, these ideas didn't disappear. They transformed. Even today, annulments for non-consummation remain possible in Catholic canon law. The process is more discreet now, the examinations less invasive, but the principle remains. Marriage without consummation is not fully valid. And while we no longer drag men before panels of physicians to prove their virility, we've replaced those trials with different forms of judgment, fertility clinics, performance medications, and the constant cultural pressure on men to prove their masculine capability in the bedroom. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We focus so much on what happened when marriages failed, when men couldn't perform, when the system broke down. But what about the everyday reality for couples who could physically consummate their marriages? What happened when they went to confession and had to describe their intimate lives to their priests? Because that's where the true, ongoing control existed, not in the dramatic courtroom trials, but in the quiet confessional boxes where medieval people brought their sexual sins week after week, year after year. The confessional was supposed to be a place of healing, a sacred space where you could unburden your soul and receive God's forgiveness. But for medieval married couples, stepping into that small wooden box meant something else entirely. It meant describing your intimate life in excruciating detail to a man who might be your neighbour, your wife's cousin, or someone you'd see at the market the next day. And that man, your priest, wasn't just listening sympathetically. He was consulting a handbook, a literal instruction manual that categorized every possible sexual sin and assigned each one a specific penance. Welcome to the world of penitentials, the medieval guidebooks that turned confession into an interrogation and made priests into bedroom police. These books are remarkable documents. Historians studying medieval sexuality rely heavily on them because they provide our most detailed window into what people actually did in private, or at least what they felt guilty enough about to confess. The penitentials weren't official church doctrine in the strictest sense. In fact, the Council of Paris in 829 actually condemned them, calling them unreliable and potentially harmful. But that condemnation did nothing to stop their spread. Priests needed guidance. When a parishioner came to confession, the priest had to know what questions to ask, how to assess the severity of the sin, and what penance to assign. The penitentials filled that need. The earliest penitentials emerged in Ireland in the 6th century, created by Irish monks who pioneered the practice of private confession. Before this, Christians confessed their sins publicly, standing before the entire congregation to declare their transgressions and accept public penance. But Irish monasticism developed a different approach. Private, one-on-one confession between penitent and priest, conducted in secret. This innovation spread across Europe, and with it came the need for standardized guidelines. How do you handle confessions if every priest makes up his own rules? So the monks began compiling lists. These lists started simple, basic sins with recommended penances, but they grew increasingly detailed, increasingly specific, increasingly obsessed with sexual behavior. By the time we reach the medieval period, some penitentials ran to hundreds of pages, cataloguing sins most people wouldn't even imagine. Let me give you a sense of just how thorough these handbooks became. The Penitential of Finian, one of the earliest Irish examples from the 6th century, sets the tone. It divides sins into categories and assigns penances based on the sinner's status. A bishop who commits a sexual sin faces harsher punishment than a layperson who commits the same sin, because the bishop should know better. The logic is almost corporate. Higher rank means higher accountability. Finian specifies that married couples must abstain during 3 40-day periods each year, which we've discussed. But he goes further, listing specific penances for violations. If you have relations during one of these forbidden periods, you fast for 40 days. If you do it repeatedly, the penance compounds. But Finian's handbook is gentle compared to what came later. The Penitential of Theodore, compiled in the 7th century and attributed to Theodore of Tarsus, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is extraordinarily detailed. Theodore must have heard some wild confessions because his handbook addresses scenarios that seem almost impossibly specific. Let's walk through some examples, because they reveal not just what was forbidden, but what medieval people were actually doing. Masturbation appears repeatedly in the penitentials, with varying degrees of severity. If a layperson masturbates, the standard penance is 40 days of fasting. 40 days, that's over a month of eating only bread and water. But Theodore makes distinctions. If you're a young person, unmarried, struggling with natural urges, the penance might be reduced. Some confessors were instructed to be merciful toward youth, acknowledging that celibacy was difficult and that masturbation, while sinful, was at least better than fornication. But if you're older, married, someone who should have a legitimate outlet for sexual desires, the penance increases, sometimes up to 2 years of fasting and other penances. For women, the situation was even more fraught. Theodore's penitential states, "If a woman practices solitary vice, she shall do penance for the same period as a man," meaning 40 days to 2 years depending on circumstances. But there's an additional layer of shame for women. Medieval society viewed female sexuality as inherently more dangerous, more likely to lead to sin, more in need of control. A woman confessing to masturbation wasn't just admitting to a sexual sin, she was confirming society's suspicions about women's carnal nature. Now let's talk about same-sex activity, which the penitentials address with disturbing frequency. Theodore's handbook specifies, "If a woman practices vice with a woman, she shall do penance for 3 years." For men, the penances are even harsher. "He who after his 20th year defiles himself with a male shall do penance for 15 years. 15 years. That's not a typo. 15 years of fasting, prayer, and other penances for a single act. A male who commits fornication with a male faces 10 years of penance, with severity increasing based on age and frequency. But here's what's fascinating and deeply troubling about these entries. They reveal that same-sex behavior was common enough to require detailed categorization. The penitentials wouldn't dedicate so much space to these sins if priests weren't regularly hearing confessions about them. Medieval society officially condemned such acts as against nature, as perversions of God's design. But the evidence suggests that despite the condemnation, despite the harsh penances, people still engaged in these behaviors and felt compelled to confess them. The penitentials also address what they called pollution during sleep, what we'd call wet dreams, even something completely involuntary, something that happened while you were unconscious. Required penance. The Penitential of Cummian, an Irish text from the 7th century, specifies, "He who is willingly polluted during sleep shall arise and sing 9 psalms in order, kneeling. On the following day he shall live on bread and water." But Cummian makes distinctions. If you merely desired sin in your sleep but didn't have an emission, the penance is lighter, 15 psalms. If you sinned in your dream and were polluted, that's 24 psalms. Can you imagine? You're a medieval man. You have a sexual dream, something entirely beyond your conscious control. You wake up and realize what happened. Now you have to spend the morning on your knees singing psalms, and the entire next day you can only eat bread and water. Your body's natural nocturnal processes have made you a sinner requiring penance. The psychological burden of this must have been crushing. The penitentials get even more specific when addressing marital sexuality. We've already discussed the forbidden days and positions, but the handbooks provide exact penances for each violation. Having relations on Sunday, 1 to 3 days of fasting. During Lent, much longer, because you violated a major holy season. With your wife during her menstrual period. The penitential of Theodore suggests significant penance because you've engaged with ritually unclean blood. During pregnancy, again extended fasting and prayer, because you're engaging in sex that cannot result in additional conception, proving your motivation was pleasure rather than procreation. But here's where the penitentials reveal their most problematic aspect. The interrogation protocols. Priests were given specific questions to ask married penitents. The handbook would suggest, ask him if he has known his wife on a forbidden day. Ask him if he has engaged in unnatural positions, and ask him if he has practiced contra naturam. These weren't casual inquiries, they were systematic interrogations designed to uncover sins the penitent might not volunteer on their own. Yet the Church also recognized a danger here. If a priest asked too explicitly about specific sexual acts, he might inadvertently educate the penitent about new ways to sin. Imagine you're a simple peasant who's only ever had marital relations in the most basic way. You come to confession feeling vaguely guilty about enjoying your wife's company too much. The priest starts asking you detailed questions about various positions, various acts, various possibilities. Suddenly you're thinking, oh, you can do that. I didn't know that was even an option. Now you're curious. You might try these things. The priest, in trying to root out sin, has actually planted new ideas, so the penitentials advise priests to be vague when possible. Instead of naming specific acts, they should ask general questions. Have you known your wife other than as nature demands? If the penitent says yes and seems to understand what that means, the priest can dig deeper. But if the penitent looks confused, some handbooks suggested the priest should simply move on. Better to let some sins go unconfessed than to corrupt an innocent mind with explicit descriptions. This created bizarre situations. Your penance could depend entirely on how guilty you felt and how explicitly you confessed. If you vaguely admitted to marital excess without details, your priest might assign a light penance, uncertain of the exact nature of your sin. But if guilt overwhelmed you, and you described exactly what you'd done, providing vivid details, you might face maximum penalties. The system almost punished honesty. Medieval court records occasionally preserve confessions that made it into legal proceedings, usually when the sin was particularly scandalous or when it led to other crimes. These records reveal the enormous range of sexual behaviors that medieval people engaged in despite all the prohibitions. People had affairs, obviously. They experimented with positions and acts the church forbade. They had sex on forbidden days, in forbidden places, empty churches, cemeteries, fields, barns. The penitentials tried to anticipate every possibility, but human creativity in intimate matters proved inexhaustible. One particularly revealing text is Burchard of Worms's Decretum, compiled around the year 1000. Burchard was a German bishop who created a massive compilation spanning 20 books, cataloguing virtually every sin he'd encountered or heard about in confession. His work is both scholarly and shockingly practical, He includes sins you'd expect: adultery, fornication, incest, but also sins so specific they must have come from actual confessions he'd heard. Burchard asks women, "Have you done what some women do, fabricating a device shaped like the male member to satisfy your desires?" He's describing a dildo, and he's asking about it in confession. If a woman said yes, the penance was significant, usually several years of fasting. But the fact that Burchard included this question tells us that either he'd encountered this situation personally or other confessors had reported it to him. Medieval nuns weren't the only women with access to such devices. Apparently laywomen had them too. The Decretum also addresses magical beliefs about sex and fertility. Burchard asks, "Have you done what some women do with their daughters? When they reach puberty, you have them straddle the roof with their genitals exposed, thinking this will ensure they find husbands." Or, "Have you collected semen in fabric and buried it in the earth, believing this would affect someone's love for you?" These questions blend sexual sins with superstitious practices, revealing how medieval people combined Christian belief with older folk traditions. What strikes me most about the penitentials is their ambition. The church wanted total knowledge of its flock's intimate lives. Every sexual thought, every act, every desire was supposed to be confessed, categorized, and assigned appropriate penance. Nothing was too private, too personal, too embarrassing. The confessional became a surveillance mechanism, and priests became the recording secretaries of medieval sexuality. But did the system work? Did people actually confess everything? Almost certainly not. The very existence of these handbooks, their constant revision and expansion, suggests that people kept sinning despite the penances. The penitentials had to keep being updated because new situations arose, new questions needed answers, new sins required categorization. If everyone had followed the rules perfectly after confessing, the handbooks would have become unnecessary. Instead, they grew more elaborate, and there's evidence that many people simply avoided confession when possible. The church had to mandate annual confession for all Christians, at least once per year, typically before Easter. This requirement, established in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, suggests that left to their own devices, many people weren't confessing regularly. They stayed away from the confessional box because they knew what awaited them there: uncomfortable questions, judgment, and penances that would disrupt their lives. Others confessed selectively, admitting to minor sins while omitting the major ones. You might confess to having marital relations on a forbidden day, a relatively minor infraction with a manageable penance, while staying silent about the position you used or the pleasure you felt. Priests suspected this, of course. The penitentials include advice on how to detect lying or incomplete confessions, but without forcing specific admissions, priests had limited ability to uncover hidden sins. The whole system created a culture of sexual shame and secrecy that persisted for centuries. Medieval people learned to separate their public religious identity from their private behavior. They learned to feel guilty about natural desires, to fear their own bodies, to mistrust their own motivations. Even married couples who genuinely loved each other carried guilt about their physical relationship, wondering if they'd crossed invisible lines, if they'd enjoyed themselves too much, if their humanity had made them sinners. But as oppressive as this confession system was, as invasive as these penitentials became, they still focused primarily on men's sins and men's confessions. The handbooks were written by men for priests who were men, drawing from theological frameworks created by men. Women's experience of this entire system was different, more constrained, more judged, more likely to result in serious consequences. Because medieval society held a deeply contradictory view of women, they were both more innocent than men and more dangerous, both needing protection and requiring control. And nowhere was this contradiction more apparent than in how the church and society regulated women's sexuality within marriage. There's a cruel irony at the heart of medieval sexuality that we need to address directly. The church and society taught that women were simultaneously more pure and more dangerous than men, more innocent and more corrupting, more in need of protection and more requiring of control. This paradox wasn't just theoretical theology debated in monasteries, it had real, devastating consequences for actual women navigating marriage in a system designed to regulate them far more harshly than their husbands. If you thought the rules we've discussed so far applied equally to both spouses, I'm about to show you just how wrong that assumption is. Because when it came to sexual morality, medieval women carried a burden that men could barely imagine. Let's start with the foundation of this double standard, the story of Eve. Every medieval person knew the tale of humanity's fall from grace, and every medieval woman grew up understanding that she bore collective responsibility for it. Eve had been tempted by the serpent, had eaten the forbidden fruit, and then, crucially, had tempted Adam to join her in sin. From this single biblical narrative, medieval theologians constructed an entire worldview about female nature. Women, they argued, were inherently more susceptible to temptation than men. Women's appetites for food, for luxury, for physical pleasure were less controlled by reason, more driven by base desires. And most dangerous of all, women could use their beauty and their bodies to tempt men away from righteousness. This theological framework created a bizarre situation where women were simultaneously viewed as more sexually driven than men and more severely punished for expressing those drives. Think about that contradiction for a moment. Medieval medical texts, drawing from ancient Greek sources, claimed that women needed sexual satisfaction even more urgently than men. The theory of suffocation of the womb taught that women who didn't have regular intercourse would suffer serious medical consequences. The retained seed, yes, medieval medicine believed women produced seed too, would build up in the body, causing fainting, shortness of breath, erratic behavior, even death in extreme cases. So women were biologically programmed to need sex, at least according to medieval medicine. Yet socially and religiously, women were expected to show no desire whatsoever. A proper wife was supposed to be passively receptive to her husband's advances, never initiating, never expressing enthusiasm, certainly never seeking her own pleasure. She should submit to her husband's attentions as part of her marital duty, but she shouldn't enjoy it too much. The ideal woman approached the marriage bed with resignation and quiet acceptance, not eagerness. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this expectation? Your body tells you one thing, your medical authorities tell you another, but your priest and your society tell you that expressing desire makes you a harlot. You're supposed to need sex for your health, but not want it for your pleasure. You're required to be available to your husband whenever he requests you. That's the conjugal debt we've mentioned. But you're forbidden from requesting him. What kind of impossible balance is that? The obsession with female virginity before marriage added another layer of control. A bride was expected to come to her marriage bed a virgin, and families went to extraordinary lengths to ensure this. Wealthy families sometimes conducted virginity examinations before weddings, having midwives physically inspect the bride to verify her intact hymen. These examinations were humiliating, invasive, and medically meaningless. The hymen can be broken in numerous non-sexual ways, and some women are born without prominent hymens. But medieval society needed that physical proof, that visible sign of purity. The wedding night itself often included verification rituals. Remember those bedding ceremonies we discussed earlier? Part of their purpose was to provide evidence that the bride had indeed been a virgin. The blood-stained sheets would sometimes be displayed the morning after consummation, proving the bride's purity and the successful completion of the marriage. In some regions, particularly in Mediterranean cultures, this display was expected, almost mandatory. Families would scrutinize the sheets, discussing them with neighbors, making the bride's first sexual experience literally a matter of public inspection. But men? No virginity requirement for grooms, no examinations, no sheet inspections, no public verification of their premarital chastity. A man was expected to have some sexual experience. How else would he know what to do on the wedding night? He might visit prostitutes before marriage, might have affairs with servants or lower-class women, might experiment with other young men. As long as he didn't compromise his own family's honor by getting an inappropriate woman pregnant, his premarital activities were overlooked, sometimes even encouraged as proper masculine development. This double standard extended into marriage itself. A wife's fidelity was absolutely crucial. Her children had to be legitimate, beyond any question, because those children would inherit property and carry on the family name. If a wife committed adultery, she didn't just break her marriage vows. She potentially introduced false heirs into the family line, corrupted the bloodline, and destroyed the carefully constructed alliances that marriage created. The consequences were severe. Public shaming, loss of dowry, potential annulment, social ostracism. In some medieval communities, adult women could be physically punished, whipped through the streets, forced to wear symbols of shame, even imprisoned. For husbands, the consequences of adultery were far lighter. Yes, the church officially condemned male adultery as sinful. The penitentials assigned penances for it. Priests would lecture unfaithful husbands during confession. But socially, a man's affair with a prostitute or a servant rarely resulted in serious consequences. He might receive some criticism, especially if he was blatant about it. His wife might complain to her family, but unless he openly maintained a mistress in a way that humiliated his wife's family or threatened the legitimate line of inheritance, society generally looked the other way. There was even a twisted logic that partially excused male adultery. Men had stronger sexual appetites, the thinking went, and women had all those forbidden periods: menstruation, pregnancy, nursing, holy days. If a wife couldn't or wouldn't fulfill her husband's needs during these times, wasn't it almost understandable that he might seek release elsewhere? Better for him to visit a prostitute, some argued, than to pressure his wife during an inappropriate time. This reasoning was never applied in reverse. If a husband was travelling for weeks or months, if he was too old or too ill for marital relations, his wife was simply expected to endure celibacy. No one suggested she had a right to seek satisfaction elsewhere. The prostitution system itself reveals the depth of the double standard. Prostitution was illegal, condemned by the church, morally reprehensible in theory. But in practice, it was tolerated, sometimes even regulated and taxed by church authorities. The Bishop of Winchester, one of the highest religious authorities in England, actually licensed and collected revenue from brothels in Southwark during the 15th century. These establishments were called Winchester geese, and the prostitutes who worked there operated under episcopal protection. Why would a bishop involve himself in prostitution? Because influential theologians, including St. Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas, had argued that prostitution served a necessary social function. Augustine compared prostitutes to sewers in a palace, disgusting but necessary to prevent worse contamination. If prostitution didn't exist, these thinkers argued, men's uncontrolled lust might be directed toward respectable women, virgins, other men's wives. Prostitutes were a safety valve, a sacrifice zone of women who absorbed male sexual excess so that good women could remain pure. The prostitutes themselves occupied a strange social position. They were scorned, certainly considered sinful and dangerous, but they were also sometimes pitied. seen as unfortunate women who'd fallen into degradation through poverty or deception, and they were definitely used by married men, by young men, by clergy who were supposed to be celibate. Medieval court records are filled with cases of priests caught with prostitutes or with their housekeepers who somehow kept getting pregnant despite the priest's vows of chastity. But here's what's particularly revealing. When authorities did crack down on prostitution, they almost always punished the women, while the male clients faced minimal consequences. Brothels would be raided, prostitutes would be whipped or expelled from the city, madams would be fined or imprisoned. But the men who'd just been using their services, they might get a lecture, maybe a small fine if they were particularly unlucky. Generally, though, they'd slip away into the night, their reputations intact. The control over women's sexuality extended to every aspect of married life. When a woman married, control over her sexual availability was ceremonially transferred from her father to her husband. The marriage ceremony itself symbolized this transfer. The father literally handed his daughter to the groom. From that moment, the husband had rights over his wife's body that she couldn't refuse. The conjugal debt worked both ways in theory, but in practice, wives refusing their husbands faced far more serious consequences than husbands refusing their wives. Medieval advice literature for women emphasized passive acceptance of marital duties. Guidebooks told wives to submit to their husbands cheerfully, never complaining, never expressing reluctance. Even if your husband was rough, even if he demanded relations at inconvenient times, even if you were tired or unwell, you were supposed to comply without protest. Refusal could justify annulment or give the husband grounds to seek satisfaction elsewhere. A wife who rejected her husband's advances too often might find herself publicly humiliated, her family pressured to discipline her, her own reputation destroyed. Yet paradoxically, wives also had limited legal recourse if husbands failed to satisfy them. Remember those impotence trials we discussed? They gave wives real power, the ability to escape unconsummated marriages and potentially remarry. But pursuing such a trial required extraordinary courage. The wife had to publicly declare that her husband couldn't perform, exposing her own sexual frustration to community scrutiny. She had to risk her reputation, her social standing, her relationships with both families. And she needed resources. Impotence trials were expensive, requiring lawyers, witnesses, and court fees. Poor women simply couldn't afford them. Medieval medical texts present another fascinating contradiction. Physicians, drawing from Glenaic tradition, understood that female orgasm was necessary for conception. They wrote detailed instructions for husbands on how to bring their wives to climax. Extended foreplay, gentle stimulation, patience, attentiveness. These medical manuals were remarkably explicit, describing techniques that modern sex therapists would recognize. But these same physicians who championed female pleasure for reproductive purposes never argued that women deserved pleasure for its own sake. It was always framed as a means to an end, never as a legitimate desire in itself. The Church's position on this was tellingly vague. They couldn't completely condemn female pleasure because doing so would undermine procreation, but they also couldn't openly encourage it because that would validate women's carnal nature. So they remained strategically silent, letting individual priests and confessors interpret the rules as they saw fit. Some confessors probably advised husbands to ensure their wives' satisfaction for reproductive purposes. Others probably warned that excessive attention to female pleasure indicated sinful priorities. The inconsistency meant that women's actual experience of marital sexuality varied wildly depending on their husband's knowledge, consideration, and the particular priest they confessed to. Medieval literature gives us glimpses of women's actual attitudes towards sexuality, though we have to read carefully since most texts were written by men. The fabliaux, comic tales popular in medieval France, frequently feature sexually frustrated wives who outwit their dull husbands to find satisfaction elsewhere. Chaucer's Wife of Bath in the Canterbury Tales openly celebrates female desire and sexual agency, shocking her male companions with her frankness. These fictional women probably reflected real female attitudes more than church doctrine did, suggesting that despite all the regulation and condemnation, women still experienced and expressed sexual desire. But expressing that desire came with enormous risk. A woman who showed too much enthusiasm in the marriage bed might be suspected of having learned her skills from previous lovers, calling her virginity at marriage into question. A woman who initiated intimacy too often might be accused of excessive carnality, of succumbing to her Eve-like nature. A woman who openly discussed sexual matters, even in appropriate context like seeking medical advice, risked her reputation for modesty and decorum. The menstruation taboos particularly burdened women. Every month for about 5 days, a woman was considered ritually unclean, contaminating. Her husband shouldn't touch her. In some interpretations, she shouldn't even enter a church. She should isolate herself, recognizing her temporary state of pollution. Can you imagine how this monthly reminder of supposed uncleanliness affected women's self-perception? Your own natural biological processes made you disgusting, dangerous, something to be avoided. Pregnancy brought similar restrictions. Just when a woman might need her husband's support and affection most, just when physical reassurance could comfort her, through the anxieties of pregnancy in an era of high maternal mortality, the church taught that marital relations should cease. She was already pregnant. There was no procreative purpose to continuing intimacy. Any relations during pregnancy would be motivated purely by pleasure and therefore sinful. Women had to navigate pregnancy knowing that for months they couldn't seek comfort from their husbands in this most basic way. And then came the longest restriction of all, nursing. If a woman nursed her own child, which most women did because wet nurses were expensive and rare outside the nobility, she might face 2 years or more of required celibacy. 2 years during which her husband's needs supposedly went unmet. 2 years during which he might be tempted to seek satisfaction elsewhere. 2 years during which she couldn't refuse him if he demanded his conjugal rights despite the prohibition, but also couldn't seek intimacy herself without admitting to sinful desire. Think about the impossible position this created. A woman spends roughly 5 years continuously pregnant and nursing if she has 3 children, not unusual for medieval families. During all those years, marital relations are officially forbidden or severely restricted. Her husband's fidelity during this time is uncertain. His visits to prostitutes might be overlooked by society, but if she commits adultery out of loneliness or frustration, ruination. The asymmetry is staggering. Yet despite all these burdens, despite the double standards and contradictions and impossible expectations, medieval women found ways to survive, to maintain their dignity, to carve out small spaces of agency. They used the impotence trials when necessary. They supported each other through the challenges of marriage and motherhood. They passed down practical knowledge about sexuality and reproduction that contradicted church teaching. They quietly ignored rules they found impossible or unreasonable. They endured. But endurance came at a cost. The psychological weight of constantly monitoring your own desires, suppressing your own needs, accepting your supposed inherent corruption, that weight must have crushed some women's spirits entirely. And yet the system that imposed these burdens on women was run and maintained by men who were supposed to be celibate, who claimed to have transcended sexual desire altogether. Men who'd never experienced marriage, never navigated the complexities of intimate partnership, never balanced desire with duty. These men created the rules that governed women's sexual lives. The irony would be funny if it weren't so tragic. And speaking of those celibate clergy, well, it turns out their own compliance with the rules they imposed on others was, shall we say, less than perfect. Nothing quite exposes the hypocrisy of a system like discovering that those who enforce the rules are the very ones breaking them most flagrantly. For centuries the medieval church thundered from pulpits about the dangers of lust, the necessity of sexual restraint, the sinfulness of pleasure even within marriage. Priests sat in confessional boxes interrogating married couples about their intimate lives, assigning harsh penances for the smallest transgressions. And yet these same priests, these supposedly celibate men of God who'd taken vows of chastity, were themselves engaging in the very behaviours they condemned. Some kept mistresses, others fathered children they couldn't acknowledge. Many visited the prostitutes whose services they officially denounced. The gap between the church's sexual ideal and the sexual reality of its own clergy was so vast, so widely known, that it became a source of dark humour, popular satire, and eventually one of the grievances that would fuel the Protestant Reformation. Let's start with a crucial historical fact that most people don't realise. Mandatory celibacy for all priests is actually a relatively recent development in church history. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, many priests were married. St. Peter himself, the apostolic founder of the church, had a wife. The Gospels mention Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, which obviously means Peter had a wife who had a mother. Early Christian communities had married bishops, married priests, married deacons. It was normal, accepted, uncontroversial. The push toward mandatory celibacy began gradually, driven by several factors. Some theologians argued that priests should imitate Christ's celibacy to achieve greater spiritual purity. Others worried about church property. If priests had legitimate children, those children might inherit church lands and wealth, fragmenting the church's holdings. There were practical concerns too. A priest with a family had divided loyalties, obligations to wife and children that might conflict with obligations to the church. And there was the purity angle. How could a man who engaged in sexual activity, even within marriage, properly administer the sacred mysteries? How could hands that had touched a woman's body then consecrate the Eucharist? These arguments gained traction slowly. Various church councils issued decrees discouraging clerical marriage, but the decisive moment came in 1123 at the First Lateran Council, when the Church formally declared that ordained priests could not contract valid marriages. Any priest who attempted to marry after ordination wasn't really married in the eyes of the Church. He was living in sin with a concubine. This didn't immediately end all clerical relationships, of course. Laws don't change behaviour overnight, but it set the official standard. Priests must be celibate, devoted entirely to God, free from the entanglements of family and sexual relationships. The reality, however, was far messier. Priests who had been married before the decree suddenly found their wives reclassified as illegal partners. Children born to these unions lost their legitimacy overnight. Some priests separated from their families, devastating wives and children who'd done nothing wrong. Others simply ignored the new rule, continuing their marriages and hoping local authorities would look the other way. And many priests who took vows after 1123 found celibacy impossible to maintain, so they found creative workarounds. Enter the housekeeper. Throughout the medieval period, it became remarkably common for priests to employ female housekeepers who lived in the parish house, cooked their meals, cleaned their rooms, and, quite frequently, shared their beds. These arrangements were transparent to everyone in the community. People knew what was happening. But as long as the priest didn't officially call the woman his wife, as long as he maintained the fiction of propriety, local authorities often tolerated the situation. Court records from across medieval Europe document hundreds of cases involving priests and their housekeepers. Sometimes these cases only came to light when the housekeeper got pregnant. A priest's illegitimate child was impossible to completely hide, especially in small parish communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The children themselves were called priest's children, or children of the church, euphemisms that everyone understood. Some priests acknowledged their children privately, supporting them financially while publicly maintaining the fiction of celibacy. Others abandoned their pregnant housekeepers, leaving the women to face social stigma and economic hardship alone. The penitentials, those handbooks we discussed earlier, had specific provisions for clerical sexual sins. The penalties were supposed to be harsher for clergy than for lay people, because clergy were held to higher standards. A bishop who committed fornication faced 12 years of penance, a priest faced 10 years, a deacon faced 7 years. The hierarchy of punishment paralleled the hierarchy of clerical rank. The higher your position, the greater your accountability. But did these penances actually get enforced? Sometimes, but inconsistently. A great deal depended on local circumstances. If a priest was otherwise effective, if his congregation liked him, if he had powerful patrons, his sexual transgressions might be quietly overlooked. Church authorities might assign him a nominal penance that everyone knew would never be fully performed. But if a priest was politically vulnerable, if he'd made enemies, if he became the target of reform movements, those same transgressions could destroy his career. The reform movements of the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly those associated with Pope Gregory VII, specifically targeted clerical sexuality. Reformers railed against Nicolaitism, a term for priests living with women, drawn from a heretical sect mentioned in the Book of Revelation. They argued that clerical concubinage was corrupting the church, that priests living in quasi-marriages couldn't properly serve God or guide their flocks. These reformers pushed for stricter enforcement of celibacy rules, harsher punishment for violations, removal of sexually active priests from their positions. The resistance to these reforms tells us how widespread clerical relationships actually were. Many priests protested that celibacy was unrealistic, that forcing men to live without sexual outlet led to worse problems. Visiting prostitutes, predatory behavior toward parishioners, homosexual relationships that medieval society found even more threatening than heterosexual ones. Some priests argued that their housekeepers kept them from worse sins, providing a stable relationship that at least resembled marriage, rather than driving them to frequent prostitution or serial seduction. And then there were the prostitutes themselves, and the church's deeply complicated relationship with them. We've mentioned that church authorities sometimes licensed and taxed brothels. The Bishop of Winchester's involvement in Southwark's sex trade wasn't unique. In various European cities, bishops and other church officials collected revenue from prostitution while simultaneously preaching against it. The justification was essentially pragmatic. Prostitution would exist regardless of church opposition, so better to regulate it, ensure some standards of safety and health, and derive income that could be used for charitable purposes. But the hypocrisy went deeper. Court records reveal numerous cases of clergy caught visiting prostitutes, sometimes even in groups, sometimes spending church funds on these visits. In 1364, a group of priests in London were hauled before church authorities after being caught in a brothel during Lent. Not just any time, but Lent, when they should have been leading their flocks in prayer and fasting. Their punishment was relatively light, suggesting this wasn't considered terribly unusual. The double standard in how these cases were handled is striking. When laymen visited prostitutes, The sin was usually handled through confession and private penance. But the men faced social consequences. Wives might learn of the betrayal, reputations could suffer, families might be shamed. Prostitutes themselves were periodically rounded up, whipped through the streets, expelled from cities. But priests caught in the same brothels? They might receive a lecture from a bishop, perhaps a reassignment to a different parish. Their clerical status protected them from the worst consequences, even as they violated the very vows that granted them that status. The most famous theological defense of this situation came from St. Augustine and was later elaborated by Thomas Aquinas. Both argued that prostitution, while sinful, served a necessary social function. Augustine compared prostitutes to sewers in a palace, distasteful but essential for removing waste. Without prostitutes, he reasoned, men's sexual urges might be directed toward virgins, toward married women, toward other men. Prostitution contained the damage, channeling male lust into controlled outlets. Aquinas agreed, arguing that removing prostitution would be like removing the sewer from the palace. You'd end up with filth everywhere. Neither Augustine nor Aquinas addressed the obvious question. If prostitution is necessary because men can't control their sexual urges, what does that say about male nature? And more to the point, what does it say about priests who claim to have transcended those very urges through their vows of celibacy? If ordinary laymen needed prostitutes as outlets for uncontrollable lust, shouldn't priests, who'd supposedly mastered their desires, be immune to such temptations? But they weren't. Medieval literature is full of stories about lecherous priests, randy friars, and corrupt monks. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales includes multiple examples: the monk who prefers hunting and fine living to prayer and fasting, the friar who's overly friendly with young women, the pardoner whose entire existence is a fraud. These weren't realistic portraits of actual individuals, they were stock characters, satirical types that medieval audiences instantly recognized. The very fact that such characters were popular tells us people knew the reality behind the religious rhetoric. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 14th century, takes clerical sexual hypocrisy as one of its major themes. Story after story features priests, monks, and friars vow seducing women, breaking their vows, living double lives. In one tale, a priest convinces a naive woman that sleeping with him is actually a holy act that will send her straight to heaven. In another, a monk regularly sneaks out of the monastery to visit his lover until he's finally caught and exposed. These stories were entertaining, certainly, but they also reflected widespread public knowledge of clerical misconduct. The rise of urban legends about clerical sexuality suggests how thoroughly the issue had penetrated public consciousness. People told stories about secret tunnels connecting monasteries to convents, allowing monks and nuns to meet for trysts. They repeated tales of priests with multiple children by different women. They gossiped about bishops who kept mistresses in luxury while preaching poverty to their flocks. Not all these stories were true, of course. Urban legends exaggerate, but they couldn't have gained traction if there weren't real examples that gave them plausibility. As the medieval period progressed toward the Renaissance and Reformation, the gap between clerical ideals and clerical reality became increasingly intolerable to many Christians. Reform movements within the Catholic Church tried to address the problem through stricter discipline, better training of priests, more rigorous enforcement of celibacy vows. But these reforms had limited success. The structural problems remained. You were taking young men, often in their 20s, and asking them to forego all sexual activity for the rest of their lives. Some managed it through genuine spiritual devotion. Many others simply pretended, maintaining public celibacy while engaging in private relationships. The Protestant Reformation seized on clerical sexual hypocrisy as one of its major grievances against the Catholic Church. Martin Luther, himself a former monk, argued that mandatory celibacy was unbiblical, unrealistic, and created more problems than it solved. He pointed to the countless priests living with concubines, the bishops with illegitimate children, the monasteries and convents plagued by sexual scandals. His solution was simple: let priests marry, acknowledge human nature, don't force people into vows they can't keep. Luther himself married a former nun, Katharina von Bora, deliberately modelling the reformed clerical marriage he advocated. But long before Luther nailed his theses to the church door in Wittenberg, ordinary medieval people had recognized the contradiction. They confessed their marital sins to priests who were themselves keeping mistresses. They received lectures on chastity from men who visited brothels. They were told their natural desires were sinful by authorities who couldn't control their own desires. The cognitive dissonance must have been maddening. And here's what I find particularly fascinating. Despite all this evidence of widespread clerical sexual activity, despite everyone knowing it was happening, the Church maintained its insistence on celibacy. They didn't revise the rules to match reality. They didn't acknowledge that perhaps mandatory celibacy was unrealistic. Instead, they kept the ideal in place while tolerating massive non-compliance, creating a system built on pretense and hypocrisy. This had consequences beyond just the credibility of individual priests. It taught medieval people a dangerous lesson: that official church teaching and actual practice could diverge wildly, that rules were for public consumption while private behavior followed different standards, that authority figures would say one thing and do another. This lesson, learned over centuries, helped create the conditions for religious skepticism, for cynicism about institutional religion, for the eventual fracturing of Christian unity in the Reformation. But even the reformers, even those who rejected mandatory celibacy and allowed clerical marriage, maintained strict control over lay sexuality. Protestant clergy might marry, but they still regulated their congregations' intimate lives, still preached about sexual restraint, still assigned moral value to different sexual acts and attitudes. The system of control remained, only its administrators changed. Which brings us to a fascinating question we haven't fully explored yet. Beneath all these rules, beneath the confessions and penances and trials and regulations, there was supposedly a scientific understanding of sex and reproduction. Medieval people weren't just following arbitrary religious rules. They believed those rules were grounded in medical reality, in scientific knowledge inherited from ancient authorities. But what happened when medical advice contradicted church teaching? What happened when doctors prescribed one thing and priests forbade it? That tension between medicine and morality created its own set of impossible contradictions. Imagine you're a medieval person suffering from mysterious symptoms. You're experiencing fainting spells, shortness of breath, erratic moods, and a general sense of malaise. You visit your physician, a learned man who studied the ancient texts of Galen, Hippocrates, and Aristotle. He examines you, asks detailed questions about your lifestyle, and arrives at his diagnosis. You're suffering from a dangerous buildup of retained seed in your body. The treatment? You need regular sexual release to restore your bodily humours to proper balance. Without it, your condition will worsen, potentially becoming fatal. Now imagine taking this medical advice to your priest, who tells you that acting on the doctor's prescription would be sinful, that celibacy is holy, that your body's demands are temptations from the devil. Who do you believe, the medical authority or the moral authority? And what do you do when following one means defying the other? This was the impossible situation medieval people faced when medical science and religious morality collided head-on over sexuality. Because medieval medicine, inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, taught a completely different story about sex than the church did. Where the church saw danger, doctors saw necessity. Where priests preached restraint, physicians prescribed regular activity. Where moral theology emphasized procreation as the sole purpose of sex, medical texts argued that sex served crucial health functions entirely separate from reproduction. These weren't minor disagreements. They represented fundamentally incompatible worldviews about the human body and its needs. Let's start with the medical framework that medieval physicians inherited. Ancient Greek medicine, codified primarily by Hippocrates around 400 years before Christ and then refined by Galen in the 2nd century of the Common Era, was based on the theory of the 4 humours. According to this model, the human body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on maintaining these humours in proper balance. Disease resulted when the humours became imbalanced, too much of one, too little of another, or blockages preventing their natural flow and circulation. Sexual fluids, semen in men, what medieval physicians believed was female seed in women, were considered part of this humoral system. These fluids needed to be produced and regularly expelled to maintain health. When sexual fluids accumulated without release, they created imbalances that affected not just the reproductive organs, but the entire body. The retained seed could travel through the body's channels, affecting the heart, the brain, the lungs. It could cause fevers, palpitations, mental confusion, and in extreme cases, death. For young men in particular, celibacy was considered medically dangerous. Medieval physicians wrote extensively about the health risks facing young men who abstained from sex. The retained semen would put pressure on the heart, they warned, potentially damaging it. It could affect mental clarity, making the person irritable, confused, unable to think clearly. In the most serious cases, long-term celibacy could supposedly lead to wasting diseases and premature death. Medieval medical texts cite specific cases to prove this point. One famous example involves a count. Historians haven't definitively identified which count, but the story appears in multiple medical texts from the 12th and 13th centuries. This unnamed count, they reported, died from excessive sexual activity, literally exhausting himself to death through too frequent intercourse. The physicians who recorded this case weren't condemning sexuality itself, they were warning about lack of moderation. The message was clear. Both too much sex and too little could be fatal. The healthy middle ground was regular, moderate sexual activity. But here's where things get complicated. The church was actively promoting celibacy as the highest spiritual calling. Monks, nuns, priests, and devout laypeople were encouraged to abstain from all sexual activity as a demonstration of their dedication to God. Some saints were celebrated specifically for their lifelong virginity. The church taught that sexual desire itself was a result of the fall, that in Eden before sin, humans would have reproduced without lust, that celibacy returned people to something approaching that prelapsarian purity. So you have two authoritative systems giving completely opposite advice. The church says, abstain, deny the flesh, transcend your base urges. Medicine says, release regularly, maintain balance, protect your health. Medieval people trying to navigate this contradiction had few good options. If you followed medical advice and sought regular sexual activity, you risked sin and eternal damnation. If you followed religious teaching and remained celibate, you risked illness and physical death. Either way, one authority was telling you you'd made the wrong choice. The situation was particularly acute for women. Medieval medicine taught that women, if anything, needed sexual release even more urgently than men. Remember that theory about suffocation of the womb we've mentioned? Let me explain it in detail because it perfectly illustrates how medical and moral advice diverged. Medieval physicians, following ancient Greek sources, believed that women produce seed just as men did. This female seed needed to be released through orgasm during intercourse for conception to occur. But even when conception wasn't the goal, the female seed still accumulated in the womb, and if it wasn't regularly released, it would begin to cause problems. The retained seed would supposedly rise up through the body. Yes, they literally believed the womb could move around inside the body, constricting the lungs and heart, causing breathing difficulties and fainting. The symptoms of suffocation of the womb, as described in medical texts, included shortness of breath, chest tightness, fainting spells, anxiety, erratic behavior, and in severe cases, complete physical collapse. The diagnosis was common. Physicians identified it in unmarried women, in widows, in wives whose husbands were away for extended periods, in any woman who wasn't having regular sexual relations, and the prescribed treatment was absolutely clear. The woman needed sexual stimulation to climax, releasing the accumulated seed and relieving the pressure on her internal organs. Now, for married women, this prescription aligned reasonably well with church teaching. She should have regular relations with her husband. The physician might even write specific instructions to the husband about ensuring his wife's satisfaction for her health. But what about unmarried women? What about widows? What about nuns who'd taken vows of celibacy? These women could still develop suffocation of the womb. They still needed treatment. But the church prohibited them from having sexual relations. Physicians developed creative workarounds. Some prescribed herbal remedies, special diets, or physical exercises meant to alleviate the symptoms without actual sexual activity. Others recommended what they delicately called therapeutic manipulation, essentially manual stimulation, either performed by the woman herself or by a midwife or female medical practitioner. Medieval medical manuscripts contain surprisingly explicit instructions for these procedures, describing exactly how and where to apply pressure and stimulation to produce the necessary release. But here's the problem. The church classified such activities as masturbation, which was absolutely forbidden. The penitentials, those handbooks for confessors, included specific penances for female masturbation, typically 40 days to several years of fasting, depending on the confessor's interpretation. So a physician might prescribe manual stimulation as necessary medical treatment, but if the patient confessed this treatment to a priest, she'd be assigned harsh penance for a mortal sin. Some women must have found themselves in impossible situations. They were suffering from real physical symptoms, fainting, breathing difficulties, chest pain. Their physician gave them a treatment that provided genuine relief. But their priest told them this treatment was sinful, that they were jeopardizing their immortal souls. What do? Risk your physical health to save your soul, or risk your soul to preserve your physical health? The church's response to this medical challenge was revealing. Some theologians simply denied the medical claims, arguing that physicians were wrong, that celibacy couldn't truly harm physical health, that any symptoms were psychosomatic or demonic. Others acknowledged that celibacy might cause physical discomfort, but insisted that suffering for God was virtuous, that physical health was less important than spiritual purity. A few tried to find middle ground, suggesting that in extreme medical emergencies perhaps therapeutic exceptions could be made, but these voices were rare and quickly condemned by more conservative authorities. For male masturbation, the medical argument was similar but less urgent. Physicians noted that young men who remained celibate would experience nocturnal emissions, wet dreams, as the body's natural mechanism for releasing excess seed. This was involuntary, so while the penitentials required some penance even for wet dreams, The punishment was relatively light. But physicians also noted that waiting for nocturnal emissions meant enduring uncomfortable build-up, potential health impacts, and the distraction of constant arousal. Masturbation provided a more controlled release. Yet the Church firmly opposed it, treating even occasional masturbation as serious sin. The most explicit medical texts about masturbation come from ancient sources that medieval physicians inherited. Galen wrote frankly about masturbation as a form of preventive medicine, suitable for both men and women who lacked sexual partners. He described it as a health maintenance practice, no different morally from any other medical procedure. Medieval physicians read these texts, understood the medical logic, but had to navigate church disapproval. Most later medieval medical writers were less explicit than Galen, couching their recommendations in euphemistic language: self-manipulation, solitary relief, manual intervention. But the medical community largely agreed with the ancient authorities. Masturbation was medically acceptable, even advisable in certain circumstances. This created professional conflicts. Physicians took oaths to promote their patients' health, but they also lived in deeply Christian societies where defying church teaching could have serious consequences. Some doctors likely gave their patients winking recommendations, suggesting treatments in terms they knew the patient would understand without being too explicit. Others probably encouraged patients to follow medical advice while also confessing regularly, essentially accepting that the penance was a necessary cost of maintaining health. Still others may have deferred entirely to the church authority, prioritizing their patients' souls over their bodies. The contradiction extended to married sexuality as well. We've discussed how church rules restricted when and how married couples could have relations, but physicians had completely different advice. Medical texts recommended that married couples maintain regular sexual activity for health reasons, not just for procreation, but for the ongoing balance of bodily humours. They advised husbands to ensure their wives' satisfaction not just to aid conception, but because female orgasm had health benefits independent of reproduction. Some medical writers even challenged the Church's position restrictions directly. They argued that different positions might be necessary for medical reasons. If one partner was significantly larger or had physical limitations, alternative positions might be required for successful and comfortable intercourse. They noted that positions other than missionary might actually improve chances of conception in certain cases, depending on the woman's particular anatomy. These were pragmatic medical observations that directly contradicted church teaching about the single acceptable position. The most dramatic conflicts arose around pregnancy. The church taught that sexual relations should cease during pregnancy. There was no procreative purpose since the woman was already pregnant. But medieval medicine took a more nuanced view. Some physicians agreed that late pregnancy sex might be risky, potentially inducing early labour. But they also argued that moderate sexual activity during early and middle pregnancy could be beneficial, keeping the woman's humours balanced, providing emotional comfort, maintaining the marriage bond during a stressful time. A few bold medical writers even suggested that orgasm during pregnancy helped the developing fetus by ensuring proper circulation of the mother's fluids. And then there were the aphrodisiacs. Medieval apothecaries sold countless substances purported to enhance sexual desire and performance. Special herbs, animal parts, exotic spices, mysterious concoctions. Medical texts catalogued these substances, explaining which were most effective, how to prepare them, appropriate dosages. The market for aphrodisiacs was substantial, suggesting widespread interest in enhancing sexual function. But from the Church's perspective, using aphrodisiacs to increase desire was problematic. If the only legitimate reason for sex was procreation, why would you need to artificially enhance desire? The very use of aphrodisiacs suggested you were prioritizing pleasure over duty. The tension between medical and moral authorities on sexuality reflected a broader medieval struggle between reason and faith, between empirical observation and religious dogma, between the body and the soul. Medicine was increasingly based on systematic study of how bodies actually worked, what treatments actually helped patients. What natural processes could be observed and documented. Religion operated from revealed truth, divine commandments, theological logic that didn't necessarily correspond to physical reality. Medieval people living at this intersection had to make constant judgment calls. When do I listen to my doctor? When do I listen to my priest? What if they're both right in different ways? What if my body is telling me one thing, my physician is confirming it, but my religion is condemning it? These weren't just abstract philosophical questions. They had real consequences for daily life, for health decisions, for the guilt people carried about their own natural functions. The ultimate irony is that both systems claim to have people's best interests at heart. Physicians genuinely believed their recommendations would preserve health and prevent suffering. Priests genuinely believed their guidance would save souls and ensure eternal life. But caught between these competing claims to authority, medieval people often had no good options. Whatever choice they made, someone was telling them it was wrong. And this medical moral tension didn't just affect individual decisions about sex and health. It shaped how medieval people understood the entire purpose of marriage itself. Because if the church said marriage existed solely for procreation, but medicine said sex served vital health functions beyond reproduction, and personal experience suggested that marriage was about love, companionship, economic partnership, and yes, pleasure, well then what was marriage actually for? That question, and the Church's attempts to control the answer, created some of the most powerful mechanisms of social control medieval Europe ever developed. The most radical thing about medieval marriage, the aspect that would shock most modern people if they truly understood it, wasn't the sexual regulations or the public bedding ceremonies or even the impotence trials. It was this: love was optional. In fact, for most of medieval history, love was considered largely irrelevant to the institution of marriage. You married for property, for alliances, for economic security, for social advancement. You married because your parents negotiated a contract with another family. You married to consolidate land holdings, to settle debts, to end feuds, to create business partnerships. Love might develop after marriage if you were lucky, but marrying for love, that was a dangerous innovation, a threat to social order, a foolish prioritization of individual feeling over family interest. And yet, paradoxically, it was the church, the same institution that regulated every aspect of marital sexuality, that eventually introduced the revolutionary idea that consent mattered, that individuals had some say in whom they married. The resulting tension between church law and social practice created centuries of conflict, confusion, and some genuinely heartbreaking human stories. Let's start with what marriage actually meant for most medieval families. If you were nobility, your marriage was a political treaty in human form. When two noble families arranged a marriage between their children, they were negotiating about land rights, inheritance patterns, military alliances, and economic partnerships. The bride brought a dowry, money, land, livestock, valuable goods, that became part of the groom's family wealth. In return, the groom's family provided security, social status, and connections. The young people getting married were essentially pawns in a much larger game of power and property. These negotiations could begin when children were shockingly young. Betrothals, formal promises of future marriage, could be contracted when a girl was as young as 7 years old. The church officially set the minimum age for marriage itself at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, based loosely on when puberty was assumed to begin. But betrothals could happen earlier, binding children to future spouses they'd never met, sometimes hadn't even seen. Imagine being 7 years old and learning that your parents have promised you to a boy from another family. You have no say in this decision. You might not meet your future husband for years. When you finally do meet, perhaps at 10 or 11, you're expected to accept this arrangement without complaint. By 12, you could be married, living in a stranger's household, expected to produce children with someone you barely know. This was normal. This was how aristocratic marriage worked. For wealthy merchant families, the calculations were similar but focused more on commercial advantage. A merchant might marry his daughter to another merchant's son to create a business partnership, to gain access to new trade routes, to consolidate commercial interests. The young couple's personal compatibility was secondary to the economic benefits the union would bring to both families. Even among peasants and the lower classes, marriages were economic arrangements. A young man needed to demonstrate he could support a wife. He needed land to farm or a trade skill or some means of income before he'd be considered marriage material. A young woman brought whatever modest dowry her family could afford, perhaps some household goods, maybe a few animals, some savings. Peasant couples often had more choice than nobility. Their marriages mattered less politically, so parents might be more willing to consider their children's preferences. But economic factors still dominated. You married someone who could help you survive, who'd be a good work partner, who'd contribute to the household economy. Romantic love existed, of course. Medieval literature is full of passionate love stories. But significantly, most of these stories are about love outside marriage. The tradition of courtly love, which developed in the 12th century primarily in southern France, celebrated romantic passion between a knight and a noble lady, who was almost always married to someone else. The entire point was that true passionate love couldn't exist within marriage. Marriage was prosaic, practical, contractual. Real love was ethereal, impossible, forever yearning, but unconsummated, or at least unconsummated in any socially acceptable way. The most famous medieval love stories, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, are all about adultery. The lovers are drawn together by irresistible passion, but they can't marry because one or both are already married to someone else. The tragedy of these stories stems directly from the conflict between romantic feeling and marital obligation. Medieval audiences loved these tales, wept over them, memorized the poetry that described them, but they didn't generally expect to experience such love in their own marriages. Then the church introduced a revolutionary concept that would eventually, over centuries, transform marriage entirely. In 1184, Pope Alexander III made a declaration that seemed simple but had profound implications. Consent makes a marriage, not parental arrangement, not dowry exchange, not property transfer, not even physical consummation, though that remained important. The mutual consent of the two people getting married, that was what created a valid marriage in the eyes of the church. This was radical. It meant that theoretically, a young woman could refuse an arranged marriage if she genuinely didn't consent. It meant that two people who loved each other could marry without parental permission, as long as they genuinely consented to the union. It meant that the church recognized individual will as mattering in the creation of marriages. But theory and practice are very different things. How much genuine consent could a 12-year-old girl offer when her entire family was pressuring her to accept an arranged marriage? How free was a young man's consent when refusing meant being disinherited, cut off from family support, losing all economic security? The church said consent was required, but it didn't provide mechanisms to ensure that consent was truly free and informed rather than coerced or reluctant. The Church distinguished between two types of marriage consent, per verba de presenti and per verba de futuro. The first meant vows exchanged in present tense. I take you as my wife. I take you as my husband. These words, spoken with genuine consent, created an immediate valid marriage, even without a ceremony, even without a priest, even without witnesses. The second meant vows of future marriage. I will marry you. I promise to marry you someday. These created a betrothal, a binding promise, but not yet a complete marriage. Here's where things got complicated. If a couple exchanged vows per verba de futuro, promising future marriage, and then had sexual relations, that consummation transformed the future promise into a present marriage. They were now married in the Church's eyes, even if no ceremony had occurred. This created endless complications. Couples who'd exchanged promises and then slept together, thinking they were just engaged, suddenly found themselves actually married according to Church law. And since marriages were supposed to be permanent, indissoluble, they couldn't easily get out of these accidental unions. This also created opportunities for strategic behavior. An ambitious young man might seduce a wealthy young woman, claiming they'd exchanged vows before sleeping together. Therefore they were married and he had rights to her property. Or a young woman pregnant by a lover might claim they'd exchanged marriage vows, trying to legitimize her child and secure support. Medieval church courts heard constant disputes about what exactly had been said, whether proper vows had been exchanged, whether consent had been genuine, whether the sexual activity that followed created a valid marriage. The most remarkable aspect of this system was that marriages didn't have to happen in churches. They didn't require priests. They didn't need elaborate ceremonies. Two people could exchange vows in a field, in a tavern, in bed, at a friend's house, anywhere. And if they used the right words, if they genuinely consented, they were married. Medieval court records document marriages contracted in the most unlikely places. One couple married themselves while working in the fields. Another exchanged vows in a cemetery. A third couple spoke their vows while riding horses on a country road. All these marriages were legally valid according to church law, even though no religious authority witnessed them. Of course, the church strongly encouraged couples to have public church weddings with witnesses and priestly blessing. Public ceremonies prevented disputes about whether a marriage had actually occurred. Witnesses could testify if questions arose later. Priests could verify that proper vows were exchanged, and public celebration incorporated the community into the marriage, giving everyone a stake in supporting and maintaining the union. But the church couldn't require church weddings without contradicting its own theology. If consent alone created marriage, then the ceremony was just confirming what had already happened when the couple consented. The sacrament of marriage was performed by the couple themselves, not by the priest. The priest was there to witness and bless, not to create the marriage. This theological position, while beautiful in its recognition of individual agency, created practical chaos. Enter the case of Oda of Ramersdorp, one of the most poignant examples of arranged marriage gone wrong. Oda was a young woman in early 12th century Germany whose story was preserved by a cleric named Philip. Oda's family arranged her marriage to a young man from another noble family. The wedding was planned, contracts were signed, property was transferred. Everything was proceeding according to proper procedure. Except Oda didn't want to marry this man. She had no specific objection to him personally. She barely knew him. But she decided she wanted to dedicate her life to God as a religious, perhaps becoming a nun. She had a genuine religious vocation, but her family's economic interests required this marriage. Her father insisted. The wedding day arrived. Here's where the story gets extraordinary. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to take place at the groom's family house, not in a church. Philip, our chronicler, explains that the church was too far away, likely a polite fiction. More probably, the families anticipated trouble and wanted the ceremony in a private, controlled setting where Oda couldn't create a public scene. A priest was summoned to the house to perform the ceremony, but when the moment came for Oda to speak her vows, she refused. She simply said no. She wouldn't consent. The priest couldn't proceed without her consent. Church law was clear on that point. Her family was furious. They pressured her, pleaded with her, threatened her. She refused. The wedding couldn't happen. Eventually, Oda escaped to a convent where she lived out her life in religious service. Oda's story is remarkable precisely because it was so rare. Most young women in her situation would have been forced to comply, worn down by family pressure, economic necessity, and social expectation. But Oda understood that church law protected her right to refuse consent, and she exercised that right despite enormous pressure. Her story was preserved and celebrated precisely because it was unusual, because it demonstrated that even in a world of arranged marriages, individual will could occasionally triumph. But for every Oda who successfully refused, thousands of others went through with arranged marriages they didn't want. They spoke the required words of consent, but under such duress that calling it genuine consent seems deeply cynical. The church knew this happened. It tried to develop procedures to ensure free consent, asking the couple separately whether they truly agreed, looking for signs of coercion or reluctance. But these safeguards were easily circumvented by determined families. The system created particular anguish for young people who'd fallen in love with someone their families considered inappropriate. If you were a nobleman's daughter in love with a merchant's son, or an heiress attracted to a landless knight, or anyone whose heart wanted what your family's interests forbade, you faced impossible choices. You could refuse the arranged marriage, but then what? Without family support, you had no economic security. You'd be disinherited, cast out, labelled disobedient and ungrateful, or you could marry the person your family chose, fulfilling your duty but breaking your heart. Some young couples tried to use church law to circumvent parental opposition. They'd exchange vows privately, perhaps with one or two trusted friends as witnesses, creating what were called clandestine marriages. Then they'd have sexual relations, making the marriage more difficult to annul. They'd present their families with the fait accompli. We're already married according to church law, you can't separate us now. Sometimes this strategy worked. More often it led to family conflict, disinheritance, and long court battles about whether valid vows had been exchanged. The church itself was conflicted about clandestine marriages. Theologically, they were valid. Consent created marriage, period. But practically, they created chaos. They undermined parental authority, social order, and property arrangements. They led to disputes about what had actually been said and done, so the church tried to discourage them while admitting they were technically legal. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council tried to solve this problem by requiring the publication of bans, public announcements made in church for 3 consecutive weeks before a wedding, giving anyone who knew of impediments to the marriage a chance to come forward. This helped prevent some clandestine marriages and exposed others, but it didn't solve the fundamental tension between individual consent and family authority. By the later medieval period, a new concept was slowly gaining traction: companionate marriage. This was the idea that married couples should be companions, friends, partners who worked together and supported each other emotionally as well as economically. It didn't necessarily mean marrying for love, but it did suggest that compatibility, mutual respect, and personal affection mattered. Some families began considering their children's preferences more seriously, looking for matches that balanced family interests with personal compatibility. But this was a gradual shift, unevenly applied. Through most of the medieval period for most families, marriage remained primarily an economic and political institution. The bride and groom were important as parties to the contract, but their personal feelings were secondary considerations at best. They'd spend their lives together, bear children together, build a household together, but whether they loved each other was almost beside the point. And through all of this, through the arranged marriages, the clandestine unions, the heartbroken refusals and reluctant acceptances, the church maintained its elaborate control over what happened after the vows were spoken. Because ensuring proper consent at the moment of marriage was one thing, regulating every intimate detail of the married life that followed, that was the church's true obsession, and it's the system we've spent this entire night exploring. Which brings us finally to the question that matters most. What's left of all this today? How much of the medieval church's control over the marriage bed still shapes our modern lives? We've travelled through centuries tonight, exploring the most intimate corners of medieval life, witnessing how the church inserted itself into bedrooms, regulated positions, monitored pleasure, and controlled the marriage bed with an iron fist wrapped in theological justification. You might think this is all ancient history, fascinating perhaps, but irrelevant to our modern lives. After all, we don't have bedding ceremonies anymore. We don't face impotence trials. We don't consult penitential handbooks before making love. The medieval world is dead and gone, right? Well, not exactly, because the shadows of medieval sexual regulation stretch far into the present, shaping laws, attitudes, and religious teachings that still affect millions of people today. The church may no longer control the marriage bed as completely as it once did, but its fingerprints remain visible if you know where to look. Let's start with the most direct continuity, the Catholic Church's current teachings on sexuality within marriage. If you're Catholic today and you attend pre-marriage counselling, you'll receive instruction that would sound remarkably familiar to a medieval couple. The Church still teaches that every act of marital intercourse must remain open to life, meaning you cannot deliberately prevent conception. Artificial contraception is forbidden. The rhythm method or natural family planning are permitted because they work with natural fertility cycles rather than artificially blocking conception, but pills, condoms, and other barrier methods remain prohibited. And here's where it gets even more medieval. The Catholic Church still maintains specific rules about how married couples can express physical intimacy. According to current Catholic teaching, the husband must ejaculate inside his wife's vagina. That's not an exaggeration or an oversimplification, that's the actual requirement. Oral sex is permitted as foreplay, but only if it leads to vaginal intercourse and ejaculation. Manual stimulation is allowed as foreplay for both partners, but again only leading to the proper conclusion. A man deliberately ejaculating anywhere other than inside his wife's vagina commits a mortal sin. Does that sound familiar? It should. These are the same principles that guided those medieval penitentials we discussed hours ago. The specific positions may no longer be as rigidly enforced. The Church has relaxed somewhat on insisting only missionary position is acceptable, but the fundamental principle remains. Sex must be ordered toward procreation, even within marriage, even when conception is medically impossible due to infertility or menopause. The elderly couple married for 50 years is still expected to follow these rules, even though they physically cannot conceive children. Why? Because at this point it's not really about procreation anymore. It's about maintaining hierarchical control and theological consistency. The prohibition on masturbation remains firmly in place in Catholic teaching, solo masturbation is still classified as a mortal sin, a disordered use of the sexual faculty. The language has changed. Medieval texts called it self-pollution, or the solitary vice, but the condemnation is identical. The Church teaches that the sexual faculty exists solely for unitive and procreative purposes within marriage, and any use outside that context perverts its natural purpose. Millions of Catholic teenagers grow up with the same guilt their medieval counterparts felt about natural bodily urges and responses. But Catholic teaching is only the most obvious modern remnant of medieval sexual control. The influences extend far beyond Catholicism into Protestant denominations, secular law, and general cultural attitudes. Because the Protestant Reformation, despite breaking with Rome on many issues, actually retained much of the medieval framework around sexuality. The Reformers allowed clerical marriage. That was revolutionary. But they maintained strict control over lay sexuality, emphasized procreation as marriage's primary purpose, and continued teaching that sexual pleasure needed strict boundaries and oversight. Consider the Book of Common Prayer, which has guided Anglican worship since 1549 and influenced countless Protestant denominations. The traditional marriage ceremony in that prayer book declares that marriage exists for the procreation of children to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord. It allows that marriage also provides a remedy against sin and to avoid fornication, essentially the same medieval reasoning that sex within marriage prevents worse sins outside it. The language comes directly from a medieval Catholic theology, barely modified. Even denominations that have modernized their marriage liturgies often preserve these basic ideas about marriage's purposes and sexuality's proper place. The legal structures surrounding marriage in Western countries derive directly from medieval church law. The concept of marriage as requiring mutual consent, that's Pope Alexander III's innovation from 1184. The prohibition of bigamy and polygamy, medieval canon law. The requirement of witnesses for legal marriage, developed in the medieval period to prevent disputes about clandestine marriages. Age of consent laws have roots in the Church's minimum marriage, ages of 12 for girls and 14 for boys. We've raised those ages significantly, thankfully, but the principle that society should regulate when people are mature enough for sexual activity comes directly from medieval precedent. Annulment procedures in civil and religious law still echo medieval practices. Today, Catholic annulments are granted for non-consummation, for lack of proper consent, for hidden impediments that made the marriage invalid from the start. These are the exact same grounds medieval church courts used. The modern process is more bureaucratic, less invasive than those medieval impotence trials, but the underlying logic is identical. A marriage that was never properly established can be declared null, as if it never existed. Even the cultural shame around sexuality that persists in many communities has medieval roots. The idea that sex is something dirty, shameful, not to be discussed openly, that's a direct inheritance from medieval Christianity's conflicted relationship with the body. The notion that good girls don't express sexual desire, that women who show enthusiasm are somehow suspect, that echoes the medieval double standard we explored. The anxiety many people feel about their own sexual thoughts and desires, the guilt over masturbation that persists even among non-religious people, the tendency to view sex as something vaguely sinful even within committed relationships. These attitudes were shaped by centuries of the Church teaching that sexuality was dangerous, pleasure was corrupting, and the body was a source of temptation. The medicalization of sexuality in the modern world represents both continuity and departure from medieval patterns. We no longer believe in humoral theory or suffocation of the womb, obviously. Modern medicine understands sexuality in terms of hormones, neurotransmitters, anatomical function, but we've replaced medieval medical authority with modern medical authority that still tells us how we should and shouldn't express sexuality. Sex therapy, erectile dysfunction medications, treatments for low libido, these are the modern equivalents of medieval physicians prescribing sexual activity for health. We've kept the framework of medical oversight while updating the scientific understanding. Similarly, we've replaced confession with therapy. People still go to private sessions with authority figures to discuss their sexual behaviors, feelings, and concerns. They still seek validation, guidance, and absolution, though now it's called working through issues rather than receiving penance. The confessional box has become the therapist's office, but the basic dynamic of disclosing intimate details to someone with claimed expertise and then receiving advice on how to think and behave differently, that remains remarkably similar. DNA testing has become our version of the bedding ceremony's sheet inspection. We've replaced visible virginity verification and witnessed consummation with genetic testing for paternity and increasingly detailed medical examinations. The technology is far more sophisticated, but the underlying anxiety is the same: the need to verify biological connections, to establish legitimacy, to know with certainty what happens in private spaces. Privacy around sexuality has increased dramatically compared to medieval norms, but when questions of legitimacy or legality arise, modern society still believes it has the right to investigate, test, and adjudicate intimate matters. The modern purity culture movement in some evangelical Christian communities is essentially medieval sexual morality, revived and rebranded. Purity rings, pledges to remain virgin until marriage, father-daughter purity balls where girls symbolically give their fathers authority over their sexuality until it's transferred to their husbands. These practices would be entirely comprehensible to medieval Christians. The language of female virginity as precious, as something that can be lost or given away, as property to be guarded and then transferred, that's pure medieval ideology, preserved essentially unchanged. But we've also made real progress, and it's important to acknowledge that. The idea that marital rape is a crime, that a husband doesn't have automatic rights to his wife's body regardless of her consent, that's a modern development that explicitly rejects medieval understanding of the conjugal debt. The recognition that sexual orientation is inherent rather than chosen, that LGBTQ people deserve equal rights and recognition, that same-sex relationships can be loving and valid. These represent fundamental breaks with medieval Christian sexual ethics. The availability of contraception has transformed sexuality in ways the medieval church would consider catastrophic. By separating sex from inevitable pregnancy, contraception has allowed women unprecedented freedom to express sexuality without the constant fear of conception. This is exactly what the church always opposed: making pleasure possible without procreative purpose, giving people control over what the church insisted should remain in God's hands. The battles over contraception access today, in insurance coverage, in developing countries, in Catholic institutions, are contemporary manifestations of the same medieval struggle over who controls reproductive sexuality. The consent revolution in sexual ethics, the growing understanding that enthusiastic consent is required, that lack of no isn't the same as yes, that consent can be withdrawn, that power imbalances affect the validity of consent. This builds on the Church's medieval innovation that consent creates marriage, but extends it in ways medieval theology never imagined. The Church said consent mattered for marriage formation. Modern ethics say consent matters for every sexual interaction, every time. That's a profound evolution. What strikes me most looking at these continuities and changes is how much psychological energy humanity has devoted to regulating sexuality. We've spent centuries, millennia really, creating elaborate systems to control, channel, restrict, and define acceptable sexual expression. We've assigned moral value to positions, to motivations, to feelings. We've made normal bodily functions into sins requiring penance. We've invaded privacy, created shame, enforced double standards, and caused immeasurable psychological harm. And for what? What was gained by making medieval couples track forbidden days, confess intimate details, and live in constant fear of sinning through pleasure? What's gained by continuing aspects of that control today? I think the answer is control itself. Sexuality is fundamental to human experience, and any institution that can regulate sexuality gains enormous power over people's lives. If an authority can make you feel guilty about your own body, ashamed of your natural desires, dependent on their guidance for navigating intimacy, then they've established profound control over your sense of self. The medieval church understood this instinctively. By regulating the marriage bed, they regulated marriage, family formation, property transfer, social relationships, everything that mattered in medieval life. Modern institutions, religious and secular, still benefit from regulating sexuality. Religious institutions maintain authority over adherents by defining sexual morality. Political movements mobilize support by promising to restore traditional sexual values or advance sexual liberation. Therapists, physicians, and advice columnists build careers on helping people navigate sexual concerns. We've never stopped looking to authorities to tell us if we're doing intimacy correctly, and those authorities have never stopped benefiting from our willingness to grant them that oversight. But here's what medieval people understood that we sometimes forget. Despite all the regulations, despite all the threats of hellfire and harsh penances, despite public humiliation and legal consequences, people still followed their hearts and bodies. They broke rules they found unreasonable. They pursued pleasure despite prohibition. They fell in love despite arranged marriages. They found ways to be intimate despite impossible restrictions. Human sexuality proved remarkably resistant to control, no matter how elaborate the system trying to contain it. The medieval couples we've followed tonight, those who endured bedding ceremonies, navigated forbidden days, worried about proper positions, confessed their pleasures, survived impotence trials, they persevered. They built lives together. They found moments of joy despite the weight of regulation pressing down on them. Their resilience is remarkable, even inspiring. They remind us that intimacy, connection, and love are more powerful than any institutional attempt to control them. As we drift towards sleep tonight, having spent these hours together exploring the most intimate invasions of medieval life, I hope you'll take with you not just shock at what our ancestors endured, but also appreciation for how far we've come and an awareness of how far we still need to go. The battle between institutional control and personal autonomy in intimate life didn't end with the Middle Ages. It continues today, in debates over reproductive rights, in struggles for LGBTQ equality, in efforts to dismantle purity culture, in the ongoing work to define healthy sexuality on our own terms rather than terms imposed by distant authorities. The medieval church may no longer control the marriage bed, but the question of who does control it, whether anyone should control it beyond the people sharing that bed, remains vitally important. Every time we challenge shame around sexuality, every time we insist on enthusiastic consent, every time we reject double standards, every time we claim the right to define our own intimacy, we're continuing the work those brave medieval individuals began when they quietly ignored impossible rules and insisted on their own humanity. Thank you for spending this long night with me, exploring these strange and sometimes disturbing corners of history. Thank you for your patience with the difficult topics, your willingness to sit with discomfort, your curiosity about how people lived and loved in times so different from our own. I hope these stories have given you new perspective on both the past and the present, new appreciation for freedoms we sometimes take for granted, and new understanding of the long struggle for autonomy over our own bodies and relationships. The next time you find yourself in a position of intimacy, whether that's physical closeness or emotional vulnerability, or simply deep connection with another person, remember those medieval couples who did the same thing while navigating a labyrinth of restrictions we can barely imagine. Remember that you're part of a long human story, and that your freedom to choose your own path through that intimacy is something people fought for, suffered for, and gradually, painfully won over many centuries. Honor that freedom, use it well, and perhaps, just perhaps, spare a thought for those who came before who made it possible. Rest well, my friends, and when you wake, may you appreciate anew the privacy, the freedom, and the autonomy you have in your intimate life, rights that medieval people could scarcely dream of. Until we meet again for another journey through history's hidden corners, good night.